Okay, so let's go ahead and call the meeting at 6:34. And we tonight have it's a joint committee for the Urban Village and Development and Planning and Policy Commission special meeting. We have 3 agenda items on the plan for tonight. Proposed urban village replacement, Talus Parcel 17B, and we're going to discuss Issaquah Highlands. We're going to have public comment on all 3. Lucy's going to go ahead and present us with a presentation on A, and she may add some additional comments on C. Otherwise, they're going to be for us to discuss. And the first thing is we're going to approve of the minutes from August 15th, 2017. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
Yeah, make sure.
Motion to approve minutes?
Okay, do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Okay.
Motion carries. Minutes are approved for August 15th, 2017. And Lucy, you can go ahead and take it away with the agenda items.
Fabulous. So you guys got a ton of materials. This is our 3rd time here. I'm not, sometimes when we do a briefing response memo, we go through point by point and cover them all. What I did was kind of consolidate them into 8 topics. These are topics I would like your confirmation on how we, do you think that the approach we're using is right? Do you have any questions? With that, we will prepare the PPC packet for next week's public hearing. Following, and you're welcome to add more topics. Mine aren't the only 8 that are possible. And then following the general discussion and public comment and your joint discussion, then we would move on to the 2 property owners who have requested changes to the proposal and run through a sort of similar structure. They make a presentation, there is a public comment, and then you have a discussion. Any questions about the structure for tonight? So I just run through this. We started last spring, we meeting with the community and the council. We started working with you guys at the beginning of August and had a council work session last week. And this is our concluding meeting with you guys. So the first topic I wanted to start with, I'm not sure that I need, there's so much confirmation on your part, but this seemed to be a point of confusion. So we wanted to touch on it and make sure it was clear. The build-out period is something that the contract establishes. The contract is the development agreement. And during that time, there can't be any changes other than for health and safety unless both parties agree. Once you've reached the end of the build-out period, either of the 2 parties can choose to terminate. So the development agreement can continue infinitely unless one party chooses to terminate. So we've reached the end of the build-out periods. Monday was our Issaquah Highlands end of build-out period. Port Blakely has instigated the build-out, the termination for Issaquah Highlands. The city has instigated the termination for Talus. And for the other 2 development agreements, it's not that we've reached the end of the build-out period, but because they are built out except for Bellevue College, we are choosing to consolidate that process through a modification of those agreements with the work we're doing for Issaquah Highlands and Talus. Once this process has started, in terms of instigating termination, I'm not sure that there's a way to change course unless someone withdraws their termination request. And to do a new development agreement requires the council to agree, because in the end, first of all, it's a lot of staff work. Second, the council has to approve it. And if they don't agree in sort of broad outline to the agreement, to the undertaking the agreement, then it could be a lot of work for without a good conclusion. Are there any questions about this part? Okay. So, big request last time was, give us the rationale for all the sources. So that was included in your packet. I'm not going to go through all of that, but I do have some sort of further thoughts that I want to share with you tonight. So, and I'm happy to take questions on that chart if anyone has any. Overall, in doing that, I would say that my conclusion was that although it varies, generally the replacement regulations are either no change or stricter than the regulations that are in the development agreement. There are a few exceptions, and I think we noted those. I know that there has been some discussion, partly by the commissions, but elsewhere, about Central Issaquah and using that. So I put together some materials. You haven't seen these, so I realize this is, you're going to be kind of shooting from the hip. What I did was look at many of the sections of the development agreement, elements of the development agreement, the ones that aren't being terminated and aren't going to the Issaquah Municipal Code, and said, what are those? So the second and third columns list the appendices. I've listed which chapters of Central Issaquah are equivalent to those, and then I've identified which one it's going to. So the ones in the orange boxes are the ones, this group of 3 and this group of 3 are the ones that are using Central Issaquah. Landscape, lighting, parking, processing, roads, but not VUNERs, and signs. And this isn't an exhaustive chart, but it's some of the important pieces. And I think in doing this, what I wanted to communicate is that I think from a staff perspective, we feel that by retaining the goals and objectives, the urban design guidelines, the land use standards, and some key pieces like parks, plazas, and trails, that we are retaining the character. We also have the Architectural Review Committee, or ARC, and their architectural standards. We would not be using the new Architecture and Urban Design Manual that's under review for Central Issaquah, because that is definitely unique to Central Issaquah and is intended to retain or establish a specific character there. And we would say the same thing happens with the architectural standards that the ARC administers. I think there were, one of the questions that we heard from the council had at our work session last week was, are we taking our lessons learned and integrating them? Because, how did we arrive at Central Issaquah? What does that reflect? If you look at, having gone through this process, we started with Issaquah Highlands and Talus. Those were both written in the mid to late 90s. When we got to Rowley, which was in 2011, we took 15 years of experience and tried to identify by going back through regular permit conditions, lessons learned, problems we were seeing, and tried to update all of that into the Rowley Development Agreement. Same thing with Central Issaquah. Now, being a master plan community with a master developer is not the same as just a large area of the city. So there are some differences. They're not exact. But we tried to incorporate, as I said, lessons learned and also best practices, because things change over time. And I think just for you to understand, part of the reason that we looked at Central Issaquah is because it did incorporate so many of the things that we had learned along the way. One of the comments that we received from an applicant was this is kind of confusing. We have to use the replacement regulations, and if there's not something there, we go to Central Issaquah. Well, the development agreements and Central Issaquah already rely on the same techniques. They're not meant to be comprehensive replacements for the land use code. They are key pieces that will achieve the goals of that area. And so both of those rely on the IMC, which is part of why we're recommending relying on the IMC for certain pieces. And we recognize that some of the language in Central Issaquah won't make sense because it says Central Issaquah. So then what would that mean? So what we want to do, what we're proposing to do is to add edits to the replacement regulations that clarify where we refer to a place called Central Issaquah, in Central Issaquah, you would substitute the language Issaquah or Issaquah Highlands or Talus as appropriate. Same with the vision, where it says Central Issaquah Vision or Central Issaquah Plan, we would substitute the equivalent piece in Issaquah Highlands and Talus. And for the standards, we would refer to the development and design standards or urban village replacement regulations as appropriate. So what I've shown at the bottom is the way we would think about that. We are not proposing to go through Central Issaquah and strike all of this. We would add language to the replacement regulations that would, I think, preempt many of the interpretations that might be necessary along the way. Any questions?
So all the text will just be repeated twice as necessary?
So I think what there would be is this sort of a decoder ring in the replacement regulations that says when you go to 1819A, which is Central Issaquah, and you see the phrase Central Issaquah, you would substitute Issaquah Highlands and Talus, or Talus as appropriate when you're referring to a place. So you wouldn't actually replace the language. It would just tell you how to read Central Issaquah.
Yeah, so 1819A is not changing. Will
Right.
1819B then just have all the same language repeated with the same word swapped out? Or there's just going to be a little part in 1819B that says, see 1819A, swap these words out, and then make sense? Okay. So that way, because I'm just thinking in the future, if we change something in 1819A, it'll then also apply to these places without needing to go back and,
That is exactly why I would
Swap
not
them.
want to.
you don't want it in two places.
Exactly.
Okay, good.
And because you're right, it's just, it's
It's duplicative, and then it becomes burdensome to maintain.
thank you. Yes, I agree.
So, and confusing, I'm confused.
Okay.
When you say 1819A and 1819B, when you're talking about striking Central Issaquah Plan in the language and adding Issaquah Highlands and Talus as appropriate, we're going to end up with two different documents, one for CIP and then one for Talus and Highlands.
So I'm not, what I was showing at the bottom was an example of how you would read it, but not what we would physically do to the document of Central Issaquah. Because, as AJ said, we would end up with two very, multi-hundred-page documents. So what we're saying is, when you're going to use the standards in Central Issaquah, which is 1819A, when they apply to 1819B, which is Issaquah Highlands and Talus, if you have, for instance, with an AAS where it says, here's what you have to consider. Is the proposed alternative equal or superior to, and you wouldn't say Central Issaquah Vision, you would say Issaquah Highlands or Talus Vision.
So
Right.
the switch with the strikeout and the underline
Yep.
isn't actually occurring in the legal document.
Okay.
We're adding the text in yellow so that when you're reading 1819A, you do that in your head as you read the document so that it makes
Subconsciously.
sense.
Okay.
Right?
In other words, it's the definition section where you're defining Central Issaquah.
I don't think we're proposing to change Central Issaquah. I'm not, maybe, please restate your question, make sure I'm getting it.
So I'm going to look for the definition
You turned your mic off.
Is it on? Oh,
Yeah, now it's
there we go. It's complicated. It's got an on and off switch.
But you have to pay attention which one it is.
Yeah, I can't
See,
talk
they don't
and
let
push
me do
buttons at the
that.
same time. So typically in a contract, the definition section says how to read, for this example, the word Central Issaquah. And then you would put in the definition when it comes to 1819A, you would read Central Issaquah to mean either Issaquah Highlands or Talus, depending on the physical location.
The only reason I'm hesitating, Michelle, is that I'm thinking that in the code reference where we say any regulations not provided here, you would use 1819A, which is Central Issaquah. It seems like it might be useful to put this language there because it's part of how to then use 1819A.
Okay, so I guess my question is, does the use of Central Issaquah elsewhere besides 1819 also apply to the Highlands or to Talus?
No.
No, okay.
Then it might be, then I get your point, yes. Other questions? Okay. So proposed uses, a lot of materials in here. During the build-out period, Issaquah Highlands had a very broad range of uses. I think many uses that we might even be surprised to see applied to Issaquah Highlands. Talus had a broader range. They had a much narrower sort of, and I think clearer focus. You know, Issaquah Highlands was in some ways testing the waters. Now we're doing the termination and writing the replacement regulations. We are proposing to narrow the uses, match existing character and existing uses, while allowing for some evolution. And I think encouraging both the two big properties that have not been built, Shelter and TriMet, to be able to develop their properties while being consistent with the character and existing uses. There was a lot of discussion about retail versus commercial. We spent some time thinking about that. When the development agreements were originally written, there was very intentional separation of those, I think to convey the ratio of sort of build-out and character, and also to protect existing retail uses on the valley floor, either on Front Street or Gilman. And I think in looking at, I wanted something that was tangible. Bellevue Square is 1.3 million square feet. If we combined shelter, all shelters, non-residential entitlement, it would be 1.8 million square feet. And the thought that we would be building another Bellevue Square here is, I don't think, really the vision that we had. And same with TriMet's property, not singling out Shelter, but just in looking at that, that was a way of making it very tangible to us. We did, in the sort of summary chart that we provided you, highlight that there are 8 to 10 uses, sort of broad categories of uses that we have identified that can be in both retail and commercial to try and facilitate uses moving in and out and trying not to create a burden while maintaining the separation between retail and commercial uses. Any questions on that?
Could you please clarify what is meant by the use entitlement bullet?
I really shouldn't be using entitlement anymore. I meant to eliminate that from everything. So entitlement is what was in the development agreement. Now we're thinking of what is in your, there's the land use map, and then there's a chart with each property identifying their zoning cap. So that's the cap, the maximum amount they're allowed to build on their property. So what we're trying to do is, while staying true to the uses that have been built and the vision, provide some ability for them to actually use up their zoning, build up to their zoning cap. Does that make more sense?
Okay, yes.
So there were a ton of specific questions. Some came out of the commission, some came out of specific questions that applicants sent to me. I don't know if you have, I wasn't going to go through all of those. There were pages of them. And so I didn't know if you had any specific follow-up uses that you might like to ask about or discuss at this time.
For the record, I was a huge fan of your memo. I loved it. I really felt like you guys heard what we were discussing in the last few sessions, and I thought you did a really good job of addressing it. So I just want to say your hard work really paid off, and I really appreciated it. You laid it out really clearly, and it cleared up a lot of things for me. And I also really see a change from how this document has been amended, and especially when we look at kind of that commercial and residential. I really felt like you guys heard us, and I really appreciated it. So.
Well, thank you. I mean, honestly, we are looking, we have a lot of experience writing development agreements, not a lot of experience unwinding development agreements, so these kinds of questions are really helpful to us to think through the issues that are at hand.
I'm sorry, I know this is in the memo somewhere. Where, so the Shelter Holdings property, it's what is it becoming, post-development agreement? Is it still commercial, or is it becoming a?
So the entitlement they bought, we're proposing to be their zoning cap, which is 1.6 plus million square feet of commercial, 225,250 square feet of retail, and 3 dwelling units.
So the overlay for that block of land will
Yes.
just be what's the remaining entitlement?
Right.
Okay.
So just for clarification, there's 2 separate agenda items this evening, one to talk about shelter, and I think to answer that question, because they were asking for something different. So you guys are going to get to deliberate on that later on this evening.
And is
then-
there a request for something different? Was that in this packet, or is that going to come? Where was that?
On the back.
I may not have gotten that far.
Well, let me look at the
I'm
page.
sorry, we can discuss it later if I don't want to jump ahead.
It's actually,
We're kind of doing general, and then we're going to dive into each of those 2 proposals, because they're really one-offs, and they deserve their own.
but
Sure,
if
yeah,
you want to
well,
look at it, it's page 41.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, let's table that, but when it does come up, can you just refresh?
Yes.
What the current status quo that would be if we unwound the DA versus what they're requesting? But
Sure.
We can table
Yep.
that.
It may
No.
help too, for AJ and for all of us to, one thing that I thought was nice is that the applicants seem to have amended their proposal since the last time in slight ways, and so we might want to highlight that as.
Right, and we can, absolutely, that's a good idea to touch on some of that. So if, done with land uses? So we took your advice to heart. The non-residential properties were combined into a single color at Issaquah Highlands. It's called ComREIT, or REITCom, I think that's what I called it in the memo. I'm not sure it matters which one comes first, but it's the pale yellow. That was a request of you guys. I think it was a good clarification. I think the map reads more clearly about what's happening where. There was a request to include mixed-use residential into that. We declined to do that because our concern was that the map would no longer communicate sort of the general configuration of the community.
And sorry, what's REIT? RET?
Retail.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I should have said that. And then at Talus, we're using the kind of the categories that the development agreement had, which is parcel 17B is UVO for office, and this area right here is UVDC for village center. So those were kind of important parts of the development agreement, so we wanted to retain that as part of the zoning. Any questions on this?
Yeah, very quickly, I can't read the number, but it looks like the top right-hand corner, the blue box, UVO, That's going to be the parcel we're going to be talking about in the third half of this meeting.
Second half of the meeting.
Talus Parcel 17B. Got it.
Yes, and so let me, just so you guys, again, we're going to talk about these separately, but just so that you know where things are. So this is parcel 17B at Talus, and it's currently zoned office. And this is Shelter's property, number 56, which is zoned UV commercial retail with a footnote that retains their 3 dwelling units.
And then just so I can get visually grounded, the block of land that we had the TDR discussion for 6 months ago, that's the 3130? Okay, thank you.
Yep. So parks. There were questions about what was in the development agreement, and then questions about how to move this forward, what our recommendation should be. Issaquah Highlands Development Agreement had no parks requirement, at least not a requirement by building unit, but there were there was a capital facilities plan for certain recreational facilities, and then that was followed by a master parks plan between the city and the master developer. And those built out certain essential facilities. At the same time, the community values and character was that parks should be provided with all residential projects, which is kind of what led us to the recommendation we've made. At Talus, or the original requirement was 100 square feet of park, trail, or informal gathering space per dwelling unit. The first amendment to the development agreement removed that. But in fact, they built, just looking at parks, because they built a lot of trails that counted towards that requirement. But just looking at parks, Talus has exceeded that 100 square feet. So what we are proposing moving forward, and this is one of those things where I would like to know if you endorse it or you have questions or concerns. We, in the code, revised it so that both of the urban villages had the same requirement moving forward of 250 square feet per dwelling unit, which is the low end between the 2 urban villages.
And they both currently meet 250?
Yes.
Okay. But if they don't have any entitlements to add dwelling units, when would this ever come into effect?
Well, there is a point at which if they don't, we're still working through vesting, and that's why I'm hedging here. But you could potentially have a project that's vested now, that builder falls through, someone else comes along, they still have the overlay, they still have the zoning cap, but they have to build under the new regulations.
Okay, so this is specifically for all the undeveloped land that still has entitlement.
Right.
So those people.
Or if a parcel redeveloped. I mean, if you decided, I have a multifamily parcel, it has 100 dwelling units on it, my project's 20, 30, 40 years old, I'm ready to redevelop, you would have to meet this regulation.
Okay. And it's just they have to meet that within that particular urban village, has to have that amount of square feet of.
Within their parcel.
Okay. Oh, just within the parcel?
Right.
Oh, okay. So on site? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, to simplify what your ask is, using Talus as an example, right now it's 100 square feet per dwelling unit of parks, trail, or informal gathering spaces. Replacing the requirement with 250, so we're upgrading it to 250 in the event that Talus decides to redevelop the entire parcel, or we have new people coming in that want to, new development opportunities. The 250 would be what stands. 100 is where we are at.
100 was where Talus started, but they eliminated that requirement about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago.
So a good example would be the piece of property that slid, right? They had an approved land use permit. And let's assume that after they stabilize that property, they decide they want to build something else. But now we're into replacement regulations because it probably won't happen this year. So if you guys supported this requirement, oh, am I off? I should be
you're
off.
You're on.
So I got flashed. So this new requirement would be applied to the land use permit for that parcel. So even though they have a plan now, they may not be able to move forward with that plan, and they might seek a different alternative. This would apply to that if you guys adopted this as a replacement regulation for Talus.
And what would be the minimum size development that would be applicable to this 250 square feet of workspace?
So the way that it's written, it's per unit. So if you had a duplex.
But if you have a house, it's not going to be applicable to that. But if you are a small mom and pop and you want to build a duplex, like 4 units, then you'd have to provide almost 1,000 square feet.
Or 400. 100 per, a fourplex?
No, it's 250 per.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was on the wrong number. Yeah, so 1,000 square feet.
Ron's doing better math.
Sorry, it's been a long day.
Yeah,
So
it's per dwelling unit built.
So that would be applicable to someone who wants to put in a fourplex, too?
Yes.
Okay.
As it's currently drafted, you guys could suggest something different.
And what qualifies as an informal gathering space? Is that formally defined?
One where you don't need an invitation.
So just any sort of like public space? It could just be a yard or a setback?
So it would
facing
need to be, it would have to have the, I think I would take the, so I take your point. What I would say is we may need to pull that definition forward. But a piece of fully landscaped property onto which you couldn't really enter, where there was no seating, no plaza, no lawn, would not really meet the informal gathering space.
Sure. Yeah, because I personally fully support this. I just think we want to make sure we define informal gathering space so that a particular developer doesn't create something that isn't actually usable.
Right. So, single family, should it apply? Should it not apply? Townhouses probably wouldn't apply. I mean, it would be difficult for them to comply.
I mean, but if you had just the front yard, that's semi-public space, would that qualify? That's why it goes back to how you define informal gathering space. If you just have a setback that's not like a vegetable garden, but like a flower garden that someone can walk by, does that qualify? It's only 250 square feet. It's not that big.
Well,
250 square feet per unit.
Yeah,
right.
but we'd be talking single family or a single family
well,
unit
but
or townhome.
and actually, in thinking it through, what when you have a plat, those individual lots are not providing that. That's a common space.
Yeah. So if you're redeveloping a home, let's say you buy a home in Talus and you're going to tear it down and rebuild it. Do you have to then supply 250, or if that plat, is that plat tied to a specific part of the specific piece of public land, or is it just tied to just the general Talus community-owned public land? How does that work?
My thought would be that you would not apply it to existing single-family lots because they have already met the minimum standard in the community, but new single-family lots would have to comply.
So, in ignoring the issue of entitlement, but let's say you tore down a single-family home and built a duplex. In theory, you would need to then create 250 of new public space.
Right.
Because presumably you already had 250 that had been supplied when the first dwelling unit was created.
Right. You wouldn't.
Okay.
There's no way to get extra entitlement right now for single family.
Right, yeah, so I was saying, putting that issue aside.
Yeah.
So this is really would be intended for net new dwelling units.
Yes.
So then, to go back to your first example, when you had a 100-unit multifamily, and if you wanted to do a tear down and replace, and again, setting aside entitlements, you built 120 units, you wouldn't be required to create 120 times 250. You would just be required to create 20 times 250?
So you said net new would be 20?
That's my question,
I know,
yeah.
I'm sorry, I was starting to spin off on your words, and I lost track of the numbers. So if there's a net gain of 20 dwelling units, then yes, I would say they would be the ones that would have to comply.
Okay, I think it'd be helpful to have in the final text that's clear. Because if it already exists in the community and all someone is doing is redeveloping a piece of property and is not
Right.
adding any net new dwelling units, they would not be required to add any additional park space.
So I think that's super confusing. And so I guess the question is if we're really trying to say that a single-family house is exempt, then why don't we say that? I mean, so like, for example, if you had a 100-unit, or let's say you had a 10-unit townhouse complex that just met the end of its age and the property owner wanted to redevelop, right, and do 10 more units. Those are replacement, but they're new, right? And so the question is, what do you apply? You know, there's no net, but it's complete redevelopment of a parcel.
That's a 10 for 10 replacement.
Right.
So the net new is 0.
Right.
So I would say those people would not be required to create any new park space.
And I don't think that's what we were intending. I think
Okay.
the intent would be a complete redevelop would apply. But I think this is a great conversation. I mean, I would propose that you just exempt single family. So anything more than single family, like a duplex or a triplex or a fourplex, would apply this standard to.
I'm not sure, just now talking to that, I'm not sure if that makes sense, because let's say we've got Talus, which is a pretty geographically confined block of land, and let's say one of the big senior housing unit buildings needs to be rebuilt in 20 years, because for whatever reason. That's what, like 400 or 500 units, dwelling units, right? I mean, those are big buildings. Would you?
Well, Timber Ridge counts as 260. It's a senior housing thing, math.
Sure, but okay, so you're talking hundreds of units, that if that then has to be rebuilt, that's thousands and to tens of thousands of park space. I don't think that makes sense to require them to create new park space, because there already is adequate park space in Talus, and you're not increasing the size of the community.
So it would just be the net new. Again, back to the idea of net new.
Yeah, I think because I think that the spirit of this regulation is that as you grow the community, you also need to be growing green space and public space with it. And so when you have undeveloped land, I think that makes perfect sense. You're now bringing in new people into the community. You need to make sure that your public space is growing with that. But if you're just redeveloping an existing building, I don't think I'm not seeing the need to require additional public space.
I think that's true if the spirit of what is intended with this is, as you said, but if the spirit is to change so if the spirit was that now we're realizing that we wanted to have more parks, more informal gathering spaces, more trails, and then with redevelopment we could potentially have these new regulations in place for everyone, then that sort of spirit of the requirement would be 250 even if you're redeveloping, because you want to have that extra trails and spaces learning, lessons learned from previous development.
Well, and one thing I would add is that if you have a so we've gone through and done this inventory. A lot of projects would, almost every project would have something. Right now, what it says is that to reduce or remove park space, you would have to have council action. So I think the question would be, if you are redeveloping a property with a park space on it, should we just say you have to retain the same square footage that you have that contributed to that overall character? And so you would not lose space, but you would not gain space.
So if you have, and I'm just going to use Talus here as an example, if Talus had a catastrophic loss to one of the buildings, the bigger buildings that they have, under the new guidelines, they would possibly have to add more park space. But if we did something where, like for like, where they replace the building for like kind, then they would fall under what they've already developed it at. But if you have someone coming in, a development, maybe there's some condos down here, I think, I don't want to name names, but there's some condo units down in the valley that if they are deemed at end of life and the developer wants to come through and redevelop those, they would, because right now I don't believe that they have a requirement for park space per dwelling unit. So the 250 would be applicable to them because it's a whole new development. And I'm looking at the spirit of the intent, not so much the letter of the agreement.
Well, I'm also just thinking, well, I guess it's Block 11A across from Port Blakely. That is not, that's a condo project as opposed to the one across from Regal that's on individual lots. Their whole property is probably the size of the park space they would have to provide.
Yeah, and sorry.
Go ahead.
I was saying, if it applies to redevelopment, at some point in time, then you stifle redevelopment because they'll be out of compliance if they're out of land. You know what I mean?
I think Vicky really hit the nail on the head. Is the point of this to harness redevelopment as a mechanism to generate new public space? Or is this just a regulation to ensure that we maintain an adequate minimum level of public space to maintain the high quality of life?
I think we're saying that parks and these open spaces are an integral part of the character of these communities, and therefore new development that comes in would need to maintain that character. If we're getting to the end of life of buildings, that's a little trickier thing.
Go ahead.
I think that also, so it would be 250 per new dwelling unit, but then if somebody replaces again, then it would be again 250. So then they wouldn't have to be adding. So I can see how it could be a disincentive to developers that they need to provide more park space. But I think also if you want more park space, this could be a way to encourage the new developers to make more. It's just setting a higher sort of general level of park space in the community as I see it.
My point was, though, at some point, and again, we're talking way in the future, redevelopment probably, but at some point, there's not going to be any more space, so you'll be out of compliance. You wouldn't effectively be able to redevelop without being out of compliance at some point. That's what I was thinking. And you still may have a good minimum level of park space that has been instituted from the beginning, but I mean, I'm just thinking long term. Not that it couldn't be modified later or variance or whatever.
I think the net adds of dwelling units, I think, might be the best way to speak to this, so that if you have fresh new development that needs to add green space because you're growing the community, but if you're simply replacing like for whatever redevelopment reason, and this would cover the single-family homes, because rebuilding a single-family home will always be a one-for-one, I don't think those need to add any additional green space. Now, if the green space is, because I think we have other mechanisms that prevent green space from going away. I think you mentioned, I don't know if that was a question, but like, for instance,
That's
if there
not
is
a question, that's the way the code's written.
Yeah, definitely. So I don't think this regulation needs to exist in order to maintain green space. We have other stuff that ensures the green space we have stays that way.
Right.
And I think this makes sense as the additional final properties get filled in, we grow green space. But I don't think if there is redevelopment, I don't think they need to be adding net new green space. I don't think this is the right spot to add incremental green space, especially because I think both these properties have a great amount of green space that was built into the original development agreement. I don't think we need to add a rule to just keep adding it on. I think that's too burdensome.
Is that,
in my opinion.
Is there a consensus?
I agree with that, yeah.
I think I only agree with it in terms of single-family homes. I think when you look at, we're trying to nail down a number of 250, like Lucy said, this is a range they considered. This is actually the low end of what the city was looking at doing. And so in theory, it's an increase too for Talus. When we had 100, they seem to have exceeded that, especially with their trails system. But at the same time, at one point they disbanded it about 7-8 years ago. So while they have exceeded it, a lot of these units have been built to the 100 standard. So there isn't really actually an exchange going on. Technically, under the new regulation, everything is existing under half as much. in theory. And so while they have exceeded it in a way, when you go into these communities, I get very different feels from the Highlands and from Talus as far as just how they used this green space. And
Fair.
so I like that there's a protection for that. So if, I like there being an exemption for single-family dwelling units, but even going part for part, I do think that there should be something that's contributed and going back to the community, because these spaces, the trail system in Talus is a huge part of its identity, just like the parks in the Highlands. And so I do think that there needs to be some type of protectionism. So I'm actually a little bit more for putting in an exemption for redevelopment of single-family parcels, but just for redevelopment, I don't know that I agree with that.
Okay, but to reiterate, Trish, for instance, the trail system at Talus, that, oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I'm sorry, thank you.
I'm a planner.
I'm sorry, I'm really sorry. So Lucy, for instance, the trail system at Talus, that's protected hands down regardless of what we do with this, correct?
Right.
Okay.
So I come back to another question here, is if you have a development that redevelops a property that has condominiums on there now and wants to go to townhouses, that's a whole new development, different than what was there before, so then the 250 should apply.
So I would not think about ownership, whether it was platted or a condo, as triggering that. I think the question is, are we saying net new, as AJ described, or are we saying any non-single-family project, whether they're adding units or not, if they rebuild, has to meet this?
Well, that could also apply to apartments. So if you have an apartment complex
Yes.
and they are built to the 100 square feet per unit, per dwelling unit, and they want to rip them out and put in half as many condominiums, then it's a whole new development, a whole new intent, so therefore the 250 should apply.
That's where I want the net new way written, because let's say you do that and you have an apartment and you tear it down and it's a similar sized building, but you go to larger condos so there's less units. I don't see why that development would be required to add green space if you're shrinking the number of development units. I don't think that makes sense, because I'm assuming that as they're built now, Talus and Highlands have adequate green space for the community. I don't think we need to be requiring any development to grow that. Now, separately, if then there's discussion to say raise the entitlements for a particular urban village, then absolutely, then we would have a discussion about do we need to add incremental green space. But that would be an entirely independent conversation, that there would be a whole separate process. So assuming you're not changing the total amounts of entitlements in the urban village, I don't see a reason to grow the green space if all you're doing is simply replacing an existing structure.
Yeah,
But the
go ahead.
wording, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to quickly say, to me, it's like you're adding a number of users. It's like parking spaces, right? Sort of, but it's like if you're adding more units, you're adding more park users, or if you're shrinking it, you're reducing the number of park users. So I like the net new language myself. But.
So then maybe the replacement regulations language in the title would be net new regulations as opposed to replacement regulations.
No, I think you can still describe it as replacement, but you would just clarify that to add the only requirement to add incremental green spaces if you're adding incremental dwelling units.
In terms of redevelopment, I think about it a little bit as out with the old and with the new. We have a concept of how we want the community to be, and it's in this language where we have that teeth. And so even though you're replacing the same number of dwelling units, I don't necessarily think of it as green space and necessarily needs to be ground level park. I read this more as public meetings, informal public meeting spaces. And I think something that has been lost in some of our development is kind of a hidden Seattle, where the building is locked, but there's a staircase up to the roof for a view lookout point that anybody can access at any time of day. There's all these little ways and creative ways that I think that developers can actually not sacrifice any amount of land, but still increase the way that communities are interacting, and that availability of kind of flexible open space. I don't think we need to necessarily think of it as a green space, as a park, I think it's more of how we're interacting, and so I would hesitate to think of it as being like we're actually taking away land when someone goes to redevelop. I think we say, you have an old building, you want to do a new building. That means this is a new way of thinking also about how we want to interact as a community. And I would just want to add that into kind of the thought process of how we're looking at this, rather than it being a strict correlation of dwelling units to park, because I see it as being something broader with a little more possibility.
It looks like an action item for the city.
Okay, we'll make a recommendation. Plazas, that was the other one where there was a requirement and some questions about the way we had originally proposed it. Originally, because Issaquah Highlands had a required town center plaza, which was amended to be plazas, we had specified that those plazas needed to be retained as part of retaining the character. Talus did not have a plaza requirement, though some of them were built, and they were certainly part of the vision for the village center. And so we revised that to apply the plaza requirement to both projects. This is a ton of detail about different projects in Issaquah Highlands and Talus.
What's the difference between a plaza and an informal public space?
So a plaza is mainly that it's hardscape, not exclusively hardscape. An informal gathering area may have some hardscape, but it probably wouldn't be primarily hardscape.
Does a plaza count as informal gathering space, but not the other way around?
These would be, I don't know. I could start talking, but it might not be smart.
I have the same problem, so that's okay.
So, I think the point that you're making, though, AJ, is that as we proceed with these, we need to be clear about which would count towards each of the requirements. And that if we're allowing parks and informal gathering areas and even plazas in residential settings, of which there, for instance, brownstones at Issaquah Highlands, that was a required plaza, but it's in the middle of, and at the south end of Grand Ridge Plaza, in the middle of a residential project, but it's 34,000 square foot plaza. It's a big, long linear plaza. At Spring Peak, which is the one over here, it's about a 2,000 square foot plaza serving a mixed-use project, which is part of the reason why I didn't want to try and analyze it, because I'm not sure whether you would say they count separately, you divide it in half, what would you do with that? This is a plaza requirement specifically for non-residential. So I don't think we're saying that plazas couldn't count towards residential uses, towards the residential requirement. It's more, what are we going to require with non-residential projects?
So Lucy, quick question for you. In the Issaquah Highlands required, you're talking about the 34,000 square foot plaza. Let's play devil's advocate and say that that development had a catastrophic event where they lost a majority of those units and that area was being redeveloped. Mm-hmm. Under the new requirement, or the new proposal.
I'm just doing the math because I understand where you're going.
If they decided to utilize that space for development, we would actually lose possibly space, right? So those people who bought units there had the intent that this was going to be an open space and that when their like units were redeveloped, that they would still have an enjoyable space there. But under the new development guidelines, they could actually utilize that space for redevelopment.
So I don't think so. And so here's my thinking. And you're going to have to look at this little squinchy plan down here that's not quite complete. So this is called the brownstones. This is the plaza, and the plaza is required right now in the proposed code to be retained, and its size and location is identified. It's on a separate parcel. In addition, and so that's part of the whole town center of Issaquah Highlands had these 3 requirements. But in addition, the Brownstones have a triangular park here. They have a overlook sort of plaza here. They have another internal kind of courtyard here. So they have a whole series of spaces. I have no idea what the square footage off the top of my head is, but those would potentially meet their residential park requirement, and then the center plaza would still be retained to meet the plaza requirement.
Are plazas by definition their own parcels when they subdivide it?
So no, what
necessarily.
we've done, because it would be easy if everything was on its own parcel, but they
That's
aren't
what I was
always.
getting at.
So what we've done is we've done a measurement of the square footage of the area that we're counting if it's not on its own separate parcel. And we have all those saved, but the square footage would be in the table that's attached to the parks or plaza plans, so that if you are a multifamily project and we've counted this area over here and you're going to redevelop, and let's say we stick with net neutral, then you might be able to take that 10,000 square feet or whatever, move it someplace else, but you would retain the same amount.
So have you said what the new requirement is? These are the existing.
So these are the existing. In our last, thank you, keeping me on track. The plaza requirement in the first draft was 5%, and some applicants questioned that and said that was too much. So that's why we went back and looked at more projects, and we proposed 2.5%. That's what the big 2.5% means, but I didn't tell you that.
Could we do 2.5% or no net reduction? So that for Grand Ridge Plaza, if it got redeveloped, that it would maintain? its
So those
percent?
3 plazas that are shown here, this
Yeah.
one, and this one, are the 3 required plazas for the town center.
And how will those still be required post-development agreement?
They are, the parcels and sizes are on the plaza plan for Issaquah Highlands.
So those 3 are actual parcels?
No, I don't, only the one in the Brownstones is. And so we, again, measured and dimensioned them and have a square footage so that we know if there was a question in the future, we would be able to go back and look at that.
Well, so I think, and I might just be asking the same question Ron did. So then if you then say the one at the top that gets redeveloped for the Grand Ridge Plaza, in that case, the plaza requirement would shrink because it's currently at 5%. And if that lot got redeveloped, they would only have to replace it 2.5%?
I would say that comes under a different requirement, which is the town center had 3 plazas. The top 2 are between,
But the town center is owned by multiple property owners now, right?
actually, the Grand Ridge Plaza is owned by 1 property owner.
Okay, but is it a single plot? Like
No,
in theory,
it
could be
is
broken up.
multiple parcels, and they could choose to sell them off.
Sure, and so who has the legal requirement to maintain the plaza?
I believe that that's part of why we're putting it into the regulations and identifying the piece of property that it goes on. If there was a request to relocate it, we would base that on the size of the one that's provided and the council would have to decide if they were willing to allow it to be relocated.
Okay, so these 3 are protected since they are the plazas for that, and if whoever happened to own that parcel that the major plaza is on, if they wanted to redevelop that, or they need to maintain the plaza, or they need to go to council to move it to a different parcel. Okay.
And so city's not maintaining any aspect of these plazas.
They're all privately owned?
Those 3 are, yes.
Are there examples where they are public or where public is maintained?
There are parks that are publicly owned and maintained.
It would also fall under this preview. These questions that we're asking, those would also fall under this topic?
Well, no, because those are publicly owned, so they wouldn't be.
We have identified them as part of calculating, of being essential parts of the character. But again, if the council wanted to do something different with that property, we could have a public conversation about that.
Okay.
Okay. So when would this 2.5% be triggered? Just for the commercial lots
Commercial
to
or
be built out?
retail.
Okay.
Yes.
And then how are you, and then, so I guess I've got the same question I had for the informal space. How are you defining a plaza and ensuring that it's accessible and usable to the public?
Well, we would put a public access easement on it.
Okay. And would it go through a design, what level of design review would it go through?
Depends on the size of the project. We're going to talk about that
Okay.
later.
And one last question here before we move forward. You said there was some opposition to the 2.5%.
There was opposition to 5%. I
sorry.
think we'll hear in a minute if there's opposition to 2.5%.
So there was opposition to the 2.5%. What was the reasons for the opposition, and how many people were, or how many organizations were opposing it?
So we mainly just heard from the two applicants you're going to hear from later tonight. They were the ones doing the most detailed evaluation, although I have heard from some other applicants. I mean, along the way, things have evolved as property owners have noticed. They don't think their property's shown right, they don't agree with the entitlement, or they have questions about land use. But primarily, the questions have come from TriMet and Shelter.
And what was the opposition?
Well, it was in the memo. I think they thought that was excessive, that 5% of the building is a lot, that it is too big a portion, but I think I would let them make their own case.
I thought you were generous with the 2.5. Well, I get very different feels from Grand Ridge Plaza and from Swedish. So to me, I think that difference between the 1 and the 5 is easily felt when walking around. So, I mean, I may have settled more on 3, but I kind of feel like I'm nitpicking at that point. So I kind of trust staff to say, this is what we think is best. So while I understand backing off of the 5, I kind of leave it at your discretion, because then I feel like I'm just nitpicking at, that 0.5%, like, well, we should really fight for 3, So I on this particular number, I kind of felt like I needed to defer to staff to saying, well, if you feel this is appropriate, we can maintain the character, and kind of happy middle ground, that I kind of trusted that.
Well, and I also appreciate you pointing out Swedish, because if you look at their plan, so they're required in about this area and about this size, it's hard to estimate on these little drawings, a 10,000 square foot community space. But if you look at the way the hospital and medical office building that's been developed to date, they have what we call the meadow, which is quite large. They have a plaza and sort of eating area out here. They have an internal courtyard. They have a whole series of spaces. So this is setting a certain minimum and expectation. It is certainly not a maximum, and we think that most entities will actually build more. But what we went to was, in Swedish's case, what did we require as part of the development agreement? And it was a 10,000 square foot community space.
It's funny that you mentioned all the different parts, because especially the internal courtyard, I think of as hospital. I think it's pretty rare that someone's going to walk into the interior courtyard and enjoy that space. I find it's predominated by staff and patients rather than it kind of serving the purposes of a plaza. So I guess I wasn't actually really counting that interior space. So the way that it's segmented to me feels a little different. Even though it's obviously segmented in Grand Ridge Plaza, it has a very different openness and feel to it. So.
Sure, and it's a good point. There are some spaces, your rooftop example is one. I mean, there are some rooftop spaces in Discovery Heights that are only available to people who are residents of Discovery Heights.
Or who know about them.
Absolutely. So are we good with this number?
So to Joy's point also, I think that Grand Ridge Plaza, when you're walking around, it doesn't to me, it doesn't feel huge or too big. It feels like a good-sized plaza for that space and for walking around. I'm encouraged to hear that those 3 places are definitely going to stay and that this will apply to other large commercial developments. But to me, it seems like that 5% based especially on this Grand Ridge Plaza idea it's a good thing for the community to have plazas when you have large commercial space because it encourages congregation. And to me, the Grand Ridge Plaza does that, so.
Okay. Height, we changed height at the request of one of the applicants. They had some good points. Originally, in draft 1, which is shown here, we had done stories. We kind of like doing stories, or at least talking about it, because it is more comprehensible to your average person. On the other hand, then you have to put definitions in about how much a story is so that you don't end up with 1,000, huge individual stories. Unlikely, but there's always that concern of what will control. The request was not to do that because there are sometimes users that will not fit into standard heights. So for instance, if you had a climbing gym, they would not fit into a standard height. If certain biomedical uses need big chases and other things as part of it, and they would not fit in. So we could have done an AAS, an Administrative Adjustment of Standard process, to allow that. What we instead did was go to a maximum height and then a specified height for the first floor.
So I had a question about this. Why wouldn't we say a maximum height or 7 stories? So 85 feet or 7 stories?
We could do that. I think that we thought that one or the other would be as effective. You're right in the sense that it is more tangible, but if we're going to set a maximum height, we weren't sure that we gained something by saying 7 stories.
Because you could actually put 8 stories in 85 feet.
You might be able to, but does it matter to us whether it's 8 or 7 stories if they have the entitlement? Zoning cap?
I don't think it does. I think this is great. I think having the stories is excellent shorthand when you're trying to explain this to people, but for the purposes of the actual regulation, I think a height in feet is much better.
And I agree that the feet is much clearer than stories. I think to the common population, they may think stories is usable living space and parking tucked underneath doesn't count as a story. There may be some confusion on that. But just capping it at a max number of footage, I think, is more clear.
Is this an increase, like for the mixed-use residential right now, from what's currently been existing?
Issaquah Highlands, almost the entire thing had 85 feet in the development agreement. Talus, for the sort of area near Talus Drive, was also, many of the properties were 85 feet. Any more questions on height? Process. This is a really dense slide. You haven't seen a lot of it, so I apologize in advance. But I think as we were starting to think through things for the draft, various pieces came up. So the first one was in the memo related to the Architectural Review Committee. We were not intending any change in the role of the ARC. We made some edits to the language to try and clarify that. I just note that in both development agreements, the Architectural Review Committee is intended to substitute for the purview of the Development Commission, just as a sort of FYI piece. Site development permits. Right now, under the development agreements, the trigger is if you have a parcel 3 acres or larger, you have to go to the commission as the decision maker. When we started looking at some of the properties, like with Rowley is where this conversation began and continued with Central Issaquah, a lot of parcels are very small. And you could have a huge building with allowed heights, and it would, on a small parcel, and it would not go to a commission. And so there was a concern that that really didn't reflect the way the community wanted to be involved with the review of projects. So Central Issaquah has 3 different categories depending on which zone. In all cases, if you have a parcel that's 3 acres or greater, you go to the commission. The difference is the size of the building. So in the urban core, the densest area, you could have a 150 square foot building and you would not go to a commission. So in looking at the 3 different building sizes, 150, 100,000, and 45,000, because of sort of the interest in the community of having involvement, we would recommend using the 45,000. Anyone want to argue with that?
No. Do you have a map that kind of shows roughly, or not?
Well,
yet?
this would apply, so the 45,000 would apply to Issaquah Highlands and Talus, the whole thing.
Oh, okay. Oh, the 150 is only for Central Issaquah.
Central Issaquah has these 3 different levels. And so when we said Central Issaquah, we realized we needed to specify which level it was going to be. And we're saying,
Use the lowest level.
right,
All right, sounds fair.
okay.
I agree with that, and I also liked your amendment to language to clarify the role of the architectural
Oh,
committees.
good.
Because I think they play an important role, and I think that those slight additions to language, I think, helped from the things we were discussing last time.
Okay, good. So preliminary plats, not a very common thing in the city, but a more common thing in the urban villages because you have bigger pieces of property. There are still some plats going through, so this is not it's not going to be a frequent conversation going forward, but it's not a moot conversation. So right now, Talus and Issaquah Highlands plats go to the UVDC, and they hold their public hearing there, and then they go to council for decision. That is like the slow boat to China, because getting through the commission and then through the various steps to council, while that was the process in the city 20 years ago, that isn't the process in the city anymore. So we're not recommending carrying that forward. The way city plats work, there is a neighborhood meeting. A neighborhood meeting means just the applicant holds a meeting with the neighborhood. It's kind of straightforward. During the pre-app phase, which is before they make their formal submittal, and then the hearing examiner holds the public hearing and is the decision maker. What we would like is, we think that there is an important community conversation that's been happening at the commissions. So we don't want to lose that, but we're trying not to have 18 different processes in the city. So what we're recommending is that instead of having a neighborhood meeting, we would have a community conference while we're writing the staff report. Typically, it would be at the Development Commission, but for instance, if a permit has to go to the Rivers and Streams Board, that community conference would happen there. So whichever commission would be, if they were already required to go to a commission, we would do it there. If they weren't required to go to a commission for some aspect of the project, then it would go to the Development Commission.
So you'd be taking UVDC out of the picture?
Yes, we've been mentioning that as we've been going along. That's our 4th point, is we've given that a little more thought, and we want to talk through how that might work.
Okay, have we received feedback from UVDC and Land and Shore or feedback on this proposal?
So UVDC has heard this. I think they're UVDC members, and they can tell you how they think about it. I think there's some regret. On the other hand, we have had a very low workload at UVDC this year. It's really just been ending the development agreements. And over the course of the next year, as the final permits are going through for Issaquah Highlands, I'm not sure what we're going to have after that. Rowley development agreement has a very high threshold. Lakeside probably won't be doing work for 10, 20 years. Swedish might be doing a master plan. We don't know exactly when. So, I think our feeling is that we really value citizens who donate their time to public service, and we want to use them. And if we have people sitting on a commission that are only being called in a couple of times a year, we're not sure that is fair to the commitment that they've made to the community. And so we can talk about this in a minute about how we're thinking about retaining some of the institutional memory of the Development Commission.
Okay, so the tentative plan would be to give this to the Development Commission discussion, or if it goes to another commission, such as the Parks Commission.
Right, or Rivers and Streams is probably
Rivers
the
and
most
Streams,
common
if
one.
it's related to those commissions. It still
Or there
gets-
might be a reason that it goes to PPC.
It would still get commission input.
That is our proposal.
Okay, and you're not ruling out the public input either, because it would be a public,
Absolutely. That's the goal, is having a public conversation at a resident commission.
instead of a neighborhood meeting, it would be at a commission instead.
Yes.
Okay, and the communications that would go out to the community would be, we'd still have the same kind of invitations to come to the commissions and discuss this as if it was at an official neighborhood meeting event like at Blakely Hall.
So I don't know what the public notice requirements are for a neighborhood meeting off the top of my head, but my guess is that they are as high, if not higher, for a community conference, and I'm getting a nod here.
Okay, so there would be really no loss, except for to UVDC. There would be possibly not existing any longer.
So from a preliminary plat perspective, I'm going to just kind of stay there for a minute. I think what we're trying to do is reduce the number of variations on how preliminary plats are being reviewed while retaining, we see the value of a public conversation with not just a neighborhood meeting, which is then just focused on the neighborhood that's affected, but having that at a commission who focuses on broader review while at the same time inviting the neighbors who are impacted to participate in that conversation.
Okay, so basically, all the same stakeholders would still have the same access to this information?
Yes.
And the same notification system?
Yes.
Or notification bandwidth, breadth? Okay.
My thought, Lucy, on the plats was thinking back to my time on UVDC. There was an overwhelming reaction to once proposed land use was posted for the preliminary plats. We would get a lot of feedback, emails, and things like that. But often, for the date that they were meeting, it wasn't necessarily feasible for everybody to show up for that. So we did have a lot of community involvement. But my concern was, often when we're hearing things on a commission level, we meet and we discuss and we have a second meeting to be able to actually, before we actually make our decision. And so I kind of liked the idea of putting in almost a requirement of looking at it twice, only because I wanted to be able to encourage as much involvement from the community. And I kind of worried especially the way that commissions are posted on the city website, sometimes that stuff gets passed. And so the plat specifically really rang to me because that was this thing that people are walking past and driving past every day. It's something that's in their community. So they kind of got this different interaction with it. And I feel like we almost got an increased amount of comments because of that. And so I kind of wanted to find a way to really retain how the community interacted with that. And while obviously you'll still have proposed land use posted, I kind of liked there trying to be some way to almost encourage more of it, since we will be losing the UVDC. And so I kind of thought of a way of almost saying that, for plats moving forward, 2 meetings within the applicable commission are required.
So there would still be 2 meetings. It would be different format. So, I'm just explaining this, then you can tell me whether you like this idea or not. The idea is to have the commission meeting while we're still writing the staff report. So we're able to incorporate that and also evaluate it as part of making our recommendation. The public hearing is going to take place at the hearing examiner with advertising and the opportunity for the public to come and participate. So instead of having them kind of within a month of each other, there would be one, and then maybe 2, 3, 4 months later, you would have another public hearing, this public meeting, public hearing at the, in front of the hearing examiner.
I like that because, again, even though maybe there isn't a public hearing at the first one, it's that revision of the document, it's that allowing the community to sit with it and see how they're feeling about it that I think is really valuable. So I appreciate that. Moving on to retiring the UVDC, I liked the proposal that you put in place about when the term ends and basically running it through April. I felt natural to me, and I think it allows them to continue to operate in this, middle ground that we're in right now. So I appreciated that kind of concrete example, since I know I've been asking you, how is this going to work? Because for anybody who's also been a part of Development Commission meetings, they get a lot on their plate. They have a huge workload, and so the idea of it just all kind of shoving over to the Development Commission, I think, is really interesting to talk about. Well, does that mean as it expands, how do we kind of make that a more realistic thing? So I liked the concept of that retirement date. I thought that was natural and makes sense. I also like the idea of utilizing especially some of that institutional experience into the Development Commission, especially when we talk about, these really well thought out and planned communities and how we want to move forward thinking about the new development and design guidelines that we want to institute. I think that it could be really helpful to our community to have that knowledge, even to extend to the rest of Issaquah. So I appreciated that.
I like Joy's first comment about the making sure that it hits the commission maybe twice. But I also want to get to the agenda time. How are we doing on time? Because we have, we probably have a lot of people here who want to speak in the public comments.
Right. This is my last, this point number 8 of 8. So I just have next steps after this one, and then we would be ready to take public comment. So any more comments about the UVDC? Okay. Next steps, as I said, Issaquah Highlands build-out period ended Monday. Next week, we're having our final meeting. Next week is the public hearing. October and November would be meetings with Land and Shore Committee. Those are tentatively scheduled. And then we are aiming for adoption December 4th, going into effect next year. Okay. Let's see if I can find a map or something to put up here.
Okay, and now we're ready for public comments?
Yes.
Do we have a clipboard that's going around?
The clipboard should be back there on the chair. Thank you.
Then we'll go ahead and open it up to public comment here at 7:56.
So one clarification, Ron, are you asking for public comment in general?
Oh,
Or
yeah.
will there be public comment specifically for each of the 3 agenda topics?
So, yeah, let's open up to public comments for the agenda item, Proposed Urban Village Replacement Regulations. And then we'll reconvene, wrap this up, and then we'll go to Talus Parcel 17B. And then we'll go to Issaquah Highlands, where we'll be talking about the shelter properties. So those other 2 will have their own public comments related to that. And then we'll close with audience comments at 8:35-ish.
Ken Eastman. I wanted to comment on the 250 square foot per dwelling unit proposal, as well as the plaza. I think that's a good idea. My frame of reference is I'm a Talus resident, and I think that the balance between public space and the dwelling unit seems about right. Staff has indicated that it's around 250 square foot. And You know, my rationale on this is I gave up a quarter-acre lot, which is a pretty standard lot, you know, back 30 years ago which is 10,000 square feet, for a 2,500 square foot lot in an urban village. And it seems like the deal is you give up a little bit of your property in order to gain community property. So in my little neighborhood of 102 homes, we have 2 parks. They're quite generous, and it feels right. It just seems to me like if one day those 102 homes were bulldozed down and it was doubled to 204 homes, there'd be double the amount of people. Why wouldn't you want double the public space? So this whole concept of if you add more dwelling units, meaning you add more people, you should have more community space. So I think that's a great idea, and I support that.
Hi, Steve Pereira, Old Town for about 10 years. So I guess part of this, and I don't understand the full context enough, if it went from 100 feet or 250, I guess I don't understand the backstory of why that background, why we want to decrease that from 100 feet per dwelling unit to 250. I like the idea of an increase in the dwelling units. I think, though, it should be applied to both single-family homes and complexes or larger dwelling units that are built. I'm also curious about how, looking backwards or looking forwards, if this is going to apply to, let's say, Issaquah Highlands in the Talus neighborhood. Is there some expectation backwards on what would be expected for the Issaquah Valley area, of what the expectation would be for parks or open spaces, a number of square feet per dwelling unit? I also wonder if that would look at things like the accessory dwelling units, how that would come into the complex. Would that also be expected to apply? What's the expectation there going, not just for these development agreements that are in place, but for future development agreements, let's say with Costco, with Rowley? What's that community expectation that we're going for? The UVC, is that the term for the, it seems like the people on that group maybe have a set experience or knowledge with UVC. Maybe there's some use in having it go before people with that experience or that expectation that we wouldn't have in place if it went to other commissions or development commissions or whomever. Is there a way to make sure we're tying in their experience and their knowledge place that we would lose if it doesn't go to the UVC and went to another body instead? Thanks.
Chris Ray.
I'm going to talk on Talus 17B.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, I guess one other thing. Sorry, it skipped my head. I'll just have it gone. Thanks.
Jeff Scanlon. Okay. Steve just spoke. Julie Clark. Okay. Anyone else care to speak about the general requirements?
Okay, so we will close comments for the proposed urban village replacement regulations. And we'll move on to discussion here. And I just want to recap some of the questions that we had discussed earlier. I want to make sure that everybody feels that their questions were addressed to your satisfaction, and this would be a good time to maybe raise up those questions again. We had questions about language in 1819B in regards to interchanging the words Central Issaquah, Talus, and Highlands. Then we had questions about plaza space requirements, 100 to 250 square feet per dwelling unit. Okay with that? Questions? Okay, we'll open up for discussions then.
I guess for me, I think that there was clarity on most of the issues. I'm not sure that there was clarity on the parks if it was net new or everything if it was redeveloped. But it's what I heard, and feel free to tell me I misheard, was you're looking for staff to take that conversation and shape it into a code proposal, which you would see at the public hearing next week.
I agree. I feel like we did a good job of kind of playing multiple sides on it and bringing up to you saying, this is interesting, it feels a little incomplete, and here's some different ways to approach that. I like to think me and AJ tag teamed the issue, so now we're going to shoot it back to you and say, show me what you got, and I'll argue with you next week.
I think the two things to flesh out at the next meeting is one, how we define the informal public space, to flesh that a little bit more, and then also is it a net new, or is it a replacement?
Or yeah, how does it apply to redevelopment as well?
One other thing that occurred to me, especially building on some of the public comment, was if they have exceeded expectations and they have a 250 square foot already, which it sounds like a number of these have exceeded expectations. If we are keeping for net new, they can lose that. I'm not sure, that might have already come up, but I mean, to me, that is troublesome, and I think that for me, because these spaces are so important and so important to the character, I would like to see the 250, and I don't think it is sort of in between the status quo and an increase, but it sounds like those parks are important to the community, and losing them would be a loss to the community, and so I would like to see 250 even for redevelopment.
Okay.
Okay, so I guess last call for any questions around the proposed urban replacement before we move on to the next agenda item, Talus Parcel 17B. Okay, so we are closing that out, and we are now moving on to Talus Parcel 17B.
So these are your slides. I don't know if you want, since they're individual, I don't know exactly how you want to do it with them.
Okay, I'll just do it.
Okay, but feel free to ask for technical assistance.
Okay. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to present our revised proposal for the development of 17B at Talus. I'd like to give a little context to the reason for our request, and I thought it would be informative to review the effort that we've made to date trying to develop this property. We purchased it in 2007 with the objective of developing an office campus. We proceeded to complete the necessary architectural and engineering plans and to secure the required permits to make it ready for an immediate construction start. We spent approximately $4 million to put all that work in place. Got the wrong one. So that just shows you an aerial of the development that we have approval for. You can see the 3 office buildings. Those are actually on the eastern portion of the site, and then the parking garage is built into the hillside on the western portion of the site.
We have a question?
Just to orient myself, where would the current fountains be if you're entering into the Talus community?
Sorry, what was that?
Where would the current fountain area be if you're entering in the Talus community?
Up. So it's up off the map, up.
See where the sort of blue pond is on the upper right?
Timber Ridge is just to the bottom of the page.
Up is east.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, 900 is out here.
North is to the left.
Thank you.
Yes.
That's the same project. That's just a perspective rendering that shows a perspective from the interior street between the parking garage and the office buildings. So that's what it would look like. In 2007, we also hired CBRE to lease the project for us. They are a large commercial brokerage firm, if you're not familiar with them. They have offices in Seattle and Bellevue, as well as all major North American cities and many international business centers. They regularly present our project to potential tenants in the greater Seattle market, as well as tenants in other cities who might consider relocating or expanding here. They also promote our project monthly to other real estate brokerage firms. To date, we've made leasing proposals to Expedia, Google, Intellectual Ventures, REI, and the FAA, and have regularly solicited interest from companies such as Microsoft, Costco, Boeing, the Issaquah School District, and many others. We've obviously not been successful in securing the necessary pre-lease to proceed with construction. In 2012, the Central Issaquah Plan was approved with a vision of creating an urban center with office, mixed use, and medium and high density housing types. Unfortunately for us, this created additional competition for potential tenants of the office project on our property. I've asked Jeff Scanlon from CBRE to just give us a quick overview of the market in Puget Sound and typical tenant requirements.
Thanks, Kevin. Hi, again, Jeff Scanlon with CBRE here in town, or in Bellevue, and I work the Seattle area as well. Just to reiterate some of the comments that Ken's made, it's been a battle. We've spent lots of hours and time and energy to secure the pre-leasing necessary to have a successful office project there at Talus. To give you some context on when we underwrote the acquisition 10 years ago, the Puget Sound marketplace was 9% vacant, as an example. The east side vacancy was 6.23%. The Interstate 90 corridor was 4.22%. Since then, the nadir was achieved in the first quarter of 2010, where the Puget Sound region was just over 22% vacant. The east side was also about 22.5% vacant. Interstate 90 was 17.2% vacant. So when you talk about the Puget Sound marketplace, that's Everett to Tacoma, that's 105 million square feet. The east side is 31 million square feet. The Interstate 90 corridor is 6.7 million square feet. Historically, Interstate 90, with respect to institutional capital, was the #1 marketplace to invest in the greater Seattle area. We've got 7 submarkets on the east side, and the reason for that, it was the additional capacity into Seattle, proximity to the bedroom communities where people want to live, and 80% of the product was exposed to the interstate. Things have changed. The dynamic that has been really interesting for all of us in this business, and this is not alone just a condition of Seattle, it's every major city in America. The tech sector is really driving the growth for absorption for space. And they really like the 24/7 experience that urban centers provide them, whether it's walkability scores, retail, services, housing, the pace, the lifestyle. We don't necessarily have that at Talus, so it's been a burden for us. Ken mentioned some of the users that we've approached, including folks like T-Mobile, Children's Hospital, Amazon, Concur, HTC. We have not left any rocks unturned, so to speak, on the opportunity to lease space to these folks. Now, today, just to wrap up here, again, as I mentioned, in 2007 when we got going, it was 9% vacant in Puget Sound. It's 10% today, 10.4. In 2007 when we got going, it was 6.2% vacant on the east side. It's just under 10% today. And in 2007, I-90 was 4% vacant, and it's 9.1% today. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Jeff. So since the last meeting, we've considered your comments on the plan we presented at that time, and we also consulted with the board of the Talus Homeowners Association. The board has advised us that they do not support any high-density rental and are unsure how retail would work absent the higher residential density. We agree with their opinion regarding the retail viability in Talus. They had indicated a willingness to consider townhomes. However, they have now also conditioned their support of any rezone on showing significant benefits for the Talus community and for Issaquah. Their schedule has not afforded us the opportunity to meet and discuss this in any further detail. So this is the zoning that we're requesting, which is basically the office zone, but the opportunity to convert a portion of it to townhomes. We've revised our previous proposal in response to the ideas and concerns that were raised, and it no longer includes mid-rise multifamily homes. In addition, it includes the retention of the office use. Our proposed zoning for 17B authorizes 516,000 square feet of office, which is what's currently approved under the existing development agreement. It would also authorize the conversion of office to townhome use at a ratio of 1 townhome per 1,200 square feet, which is the ratio that's consistent with previous conversions that have been done at Talus. We had previously proposed that a minimum of 10% of the site would be developed as office. However, that was only a suggested target, and we want to work with yourselves and any other interested parties to determine a viable minimum required office component, which permits the development of this property to proceed. This slide shows just a hypothetical example of how that might be done. You can see the office commercial, the residential shown in the greenish yellow color and the office in blue. Topography kind of dictates how that can happen on the site because the much more difficult topography is at the south end, which is where we're showing the office, and the townhomes would work much better on the northern portion of the site. The King County Buildable Land Report in 2014 notes that almost all of Issaquah's substantial residential capacity is in mixed-use zones. Our proposed low-density townhomes offer a housing type that is consistent with other residences currently in Talus and which are not readily available elsewhere in Issaquah. Townhomes will not compete for residents with the higher density mixed-use residential properties envisioned for the Central Issaquah plan. The townhome zoning is supportive of the goals of Central Issaquah plan since the additional townhome residents would be in close proximity to the retail and office uses and support their viability. Thank you for your time. Any questions that I can answer?
So are you looking to build like a mixed-use development that's partially townhomes and commercial, or these would be townhomes that would stand in as independent structures adjacent to office and commercial structures?
Well, like that example there, the townhomes would be just on the north portion, and the office would be on the south.
Okay.
So the overall project is mixed use, but the uses would be separate.
Okay.
Is there a limit to the amount of townhomes that you would be able to build, or are you proposing that it just follow this 1,200 square foot conversion?
You know, we're open to discuss that. If there was some limit on the number of townhomes, you know, we'd currently, or in the previous proposal, had suggested 77.
I think I want to say that I appreciate this revised proposal. I think it more closely aligns to the thoughts of the community, taking out the high density. And I think a big part of the shock of the change of the initial proposal was this idea of counterflow traffic. And so I would like to see some clear language to really talk about how this mixed use would actually play out, rather than it kind of being more open-ended, rather than it being, maybe a more limited amount of retail versus a higher amount of townhomes. I think it ends up going to the point of increasing traffic in the community. And so I think that how that entitlement kind of gets parceled out for this request of a rezone is an interesting thing to talk about.
Right, and we're certainly open to discuss that.
And if this was approved, you'd presumably move forward right away with the townhome construction. Would the office and commercial construction be done concurrently, or would that still continue to be dependent on
It'll be
finding a
driven
tenant?
by the market, meaning, we, in order to finance the office portion, we'll need to have a pre-lease for some percentage of that building, so we'll continue to work that until we can find somebody.
So conceivably, that section of the parcel could remain vacant for the time being?
It could.
And just to clarify, you don't expect to meet with the HOA prior to us looking at this again next week?
I don't know. I'll have to reach out to them to see what their schedule is to do that.
Okay, thank you.
And have they seen this specific proposal that you're giving now? Or have they given you feedback on this proposal?
They did not, Ken, do you remember? Did you see that slide?
I have not seen that.
Yeah, I don't believe that they have seen that slide.
Okay, thank you.
So I have a quick question for you as well. If nothing happened and we were still waiting for viable commercial space to come to fruition, and that was, say, 10 to 15 years out before that market comes to this location, obviously you have exposure. How much of a risk is this to your organization? Is it a high risk? Is it something that you could carry, and although there would be a burden in it? Understanding your position also would help me empathize with you and be able to help come up with a...
Well, the structure on this is we have an investor, and the investor advanced the monies to purchase the land with the thought that we were going to proceed with development. And circumstances, most notably the recession, delayed that. But as Jeff pointed out, in the interim, the market has changed. The tenants today are looking for that more urban experience. And so I think they would be very hesitant to maintain their position for another 10 or 15 years.
And what is your view? I know you mentioned this about mixed use, but putting retail in there, you don't believe that retail would be viable?
Yeah, I think it's difficult. Talus is kind of an island to itself. It's a one-way in, one-way out community, and so you don't get much drive-by, and there may be a little bit of support retail that can exist there, but I think it's very minimal.
Do you know approximately what the cost per square foot would be? I ask as we, as part of our work recently, as we've been looking at mixed use in central Issaquah, and so we've recently been looking at communities that also have mixed use residential, and looking at breaking it down, cost per square foot of when it becomes advantageous to a developer. Do you know at this point for your mixed use residential, where you'll have townhomes, retail and commercial, what you estimate that square footage will be?
The cost?
Yeah.
I don't have that number. We're not a developer of townhomes, and so we would work with a local builder and sell them the property to build the townhomes. We would do the office when we find the tenant. So I don't have a cost number for you on the residential.
So to clarify, the residential townhomes is just residential townhomes, no commercial, no retail?
That's correct.
Okay. Then my next question is, where the proposed office commercial is there, is that, do you know if that is that open area that was used for staging construction vehicles for Timber Ridge?
Most of that is where the townhomes would be built, and the office would be to the south
okay.
of that.
Okay.
So Ken, can I ask a clear, what I assumed is what you just said. So the office commercial piece is clear, that the land use that would be allowed there would be office, or that list that's allowed under
Correct.
office. What you're asking for in the green, if that's green, is the ability to do either office or commercial or residential or some combination, right? To not be pinned into one, but to be given the flexibility to any or all as a combination.
That's correct, with one clarification. The residential component could only be townhomes.
77-unit townhomes.
Sorry?
77 units that you're referring to.
Correct.
No longer high density.
That's correct.
The only reason you're not doing high density is because of the negative feedback from the homeowners association?
That is correct.
I don't know what the cost of this property would be, but have, as an option, realizing that you want a profit stake in this as well, has the option been floated to the homeowners associations about potentially buying this parcel if they don't want it developed?
There hasn't been any discussion about that. We'd also be willing to discuss that.
Any other
No
questions?
more questions? Right. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Okay, so I
Public
guess-
comment?
Right, I was just going to say, the clipboard is right behind Ron, so if anyone else wants to sign up, then the 3 people who have already signed up. Oh, sorry, I took the pen. Anybody else want to sign up? Chris Ray. Oh, Ken, okay, sorry.
Okay, I think just so that we have it clear, we're opening this up for public comments.
Ken Eastman, again. I'm representing the Talus Residential Association, the master HOA for the Talus community. And this is regarding parcel 17B. It's the TRA's position that we want the property to remain as it's currently zoned, office commercial. The Talus Residential Association and the Talus community do not support a change that includes residential zoning. And we understand the difficulty of the parcel owner in trying to generate interest in building an office complex. We would continue and encourage the parcel owner to seek other commercial uses for the property, including schools, either public or private, churches, or some other community facility use. And I would close by saying, should the property owner want to change the zoning, the only way that the Talus community would support this would be for the proposal to be perceived by the community as having a greater benefit than the current zoning that exists today. Thank you.
Chris Ray.
Thank you. Hi, Chris Ray, 2498 Northwest Stony Creek Drive, Issaquah. I'm here tonight as a citizen of Issaquah and as a resident of Talus. Ron, I appreciate your comment about empathy, but this question that we're really debating today or talking about today has nothing to do with empathy. No one wants to see someone have financial difficulties. A lot of people had financial difficulties in the last recession. The question we need to talk about today is what's in the best interest of the city of Issaquah and what's in the best interest of the Talus community. I think we all agree that there are two primary challenges facing this city right now, and one is about development, and the second is around traffic. Sadly, the plan on the table right now exacerbates both of those problems. We have few tools as a city to help us manage growth, and zoning is probably our most effective tool. Rezoning this property for additional residential at this time is the wrong decision for Issaquah, and it is the wrong decision for Talus. Thank you.
Jeff Scanlon, do you have any further comments? Steve, did you want to speak again? Julie Clark?
My name is Julie Clark. I'm a resident of Talus, and I just want to thank Ken and Chris for their comments. I agree with them in terms of not wanting to have this parcel rezoned for residential. I feel there's already, as has been stated, a lot of traffic. There's also a lot of growth in Issaquah right now. And as I drive by, as I drive on I-90 past the Gateway Apartments, and I see those are 400 units on 23 acres. I understand that we're asking here, the ask here is for 77 townhomes. I think it is unfortunate that the property owners haven't been able to find companies or organizations to come in and utilize their proposed office space, but I agree it could be, the space could be used for other things, and perhaps they need to consider other options, such as schools. So I just wanted to let you know I am opposed to the rezoning of this parcel. Thank you. And thank you so much for putting in all the time that you do to consider different projects in our city.
Dave Kapler.
We been going through a lot of issues with schools and locations, and people keep mentioning this area in Talus as a potential school site. I don't know how much it's been considered or whatever, but I think that discussion has to be out there because it just keeps coming up over and over again about schools, and again with the Gateway and the 400 units, and a lot of families likely living there, and other potential stuff happening in the Central Issaquah plan with residential. The need for additional school that will be serving the Central Issaquah area is definitely would be needed. And where could you imagine a school site and in Central Issaquah? It's really hard to think that somebody's going to convert some of those shopping centers that are doing just fine right now to want to convert that or sell that off for a school site. So it is a challenge, and I think the issue just needs to get some discussion. And tell me it's completely unreasonable or whatever, but that's fine. Let's get it settled. Thank you.
That's the last name on the list.
Okay. Any other additional questions for public comments? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and close the comments, and we'll move on to a joint discussion for Talus Parcel 17B. Any questions?
I'd just like to add something from prior meetings that hasn't been reminded of in this session. The traffic on State Route 900 in front of the Talus access is already rated at F, which is kind of self-explanatory, and adding more residential and commercial, or commercial, is not going to solve the traffic problem. It's already failed. And we don't have a solution to solve that traffic problem because of the way the city property lines end before we end up in May Valley. So that's an issue. One other thing I'd like to point out, Snoqualmie Ridge has a brand-new elementary school that was just opened last year. It has, this year, 7 kindergarten classes. The school has not even been open a full year, and they've already added 4 portables, and they're adding 2 more. So the school's just 12 months old, has 7 kindergarten classes, and they're projecting 11 kindergarten classes unless they have a solution to the school issue. I don't know what the math is for our population here in Issaquah, but with the number of young families that are moving into the apartment complexes in the valley, I agree with a comment that was made a few minutes ago that I think we need to explore seriously from the city's perspective how we're going to solve school issues. I don't think this is up to the Talus community or the property owners to solve the school issue, but I do think the city needs to step up and take a look at how they're going to solve that. We may have a solution with this property.
Just to clarify, schools is currently allowed?
Yes.
I have a couple thoughts. I guess I'm struggling a little bit. I sort of see what everybody's saying here, but I'm struggling a little bit with the issue of traffic. I mean, say we add 77 units, everybody has 2 cars, so 150 cars. It's already zoned in a way that you could bring a major employer there. If you want to put a school there, talk about traffic. I guess if traffic is the main concern, I'm not really seeing why adding 77 homes is, I mean, it's sort of like, maybe it's the straw that breaks the camel's back, but the camel's already on its knees, you know, I mean. So I guess if that's the major concern, then I guess I'm in favor of allowing the residential townhomes as an additional use, because if we're in favor of a major employment center and office space or a school site, why not 77 townhomes? I guess that's my thought. And maybe there are other reasons, but I'm hearing traffic a lot, so maybe there are other reasons that weren't brought up.
Isn't it, and then Lucy, you can speak to this, isn't the idea, specifically the traffic, is that a commercial, the traffic flow is going in the opposite direction?
Counterflow. So people who are going to work are coming into the community when everyone else is leaving to go to their jobs. They're leaving. And so the idea of the way that this was set up was it wasn't going to increase traffic the same way that a residential would. They're going to be coming in the same way as everybody else. And if you're familiar with Talus, it does bottleneck right there. So I think your comment about, well, schools is going to increase traffic, you know, the point of the HOA was to say we need to see a significant benefit to the community, and I think a school does that. So they're willing to do that trade-off of saying, hey, where we have some flexibility, where we see this makes a big difference in our community, does the 77 townhomes do that? They're saying it doesn't. So I think that's the argument, I think, of the...
Yeah, that's fair. Schools generate a lot of traffic.
My question for you,
My
question for you, Lucy, is last time when we looked at this proposal, staff was recommending no change to the zoning. We have a new proposal in front of us that has changed since we last saw it. Is this position of staff still no change of zoning, or?
I think that we are certainly open to the commission. We're interested in the commission's perspective, but just in reading the proposal, we have not changed our position. Just to add some comments to the traffic piece, I think the other piece is that the city has made this step of becoming a regional growth center and focusing a lot of their growth into central Issaquah. And there is a concern that even though the housing that is currently being proposed as townhomes is maybe different than the type of residences that would go into central Issaquah, it still keeps some of the, if there's pressure for residences to be built here, we would like them to go where the highest priority, because in becoming a regional growth center, we have made a commitment to the region that we will focus growth and grow a regional center at a certain density to achieve that and support light rail.
Is Talus in the regional growth center, though?
No.
Yeah, okay. So that would be an argument against adding residential, because it's not in the growth center as identified.
Right.
Well, in this meeting and in previous meetings, the community and the homeowners association, they seem to have wanted specific, or they have wanted amenities, not specific, just sort of different options, but now potentially a school or church or any retail or restaurants was floated previously, or dry cleaners or coffee shops, something, because also this is right at this exit, and that it's hard to get down into, even to get to grocery stores and those other sorts of things. So I think that it sounds like this proposal is still not meeting those needs of the community in terms of providing amenities at this critical spot that's right next to very high traffic flow and in and out, and that it would make that potentially worse without providing more things for the community that they would like to see. So to me, it sounds like it is still not providing those amenities that the community would like to see in to necessitate this change from what is currently zoned.
I empathize with all stakeholders here. Developer who made the investment and is now at risk with the exposure, but also in hearing some of the comments. And I think the location, now I don't know what the school board feels about it, but hearing their feedback on this would be interesting to hear. Location-wise, it seems like it would be an ideal location for a school, a preschool, a daycare, because of all the units that you have in there and so many young families, that it seems like those would be resources that the community would value possibly the most and as in most need of. So I would like to actually hear feedback from not only the school board, but the homeowners association on what they think would be good options to put there as well, and then what we might be able to do to help them get there.
Well,
I don't think actually changing the zoning from commercial to residential is necessarily the right option. I'm just not sure what the best option is on the table today, if even today is the right time to be discussing that.
so what the city is proposing is to keep it as office, but broaden some of the allowed uses to include churches, schools, both public and private, and
I thought you said schools was already an allowed use.
yes, but I'm just saying, I'm not sure whether that was allowed under the development agreement. So as part of coming out of the development agreement, I think we've broadened some of the uses while retaining a commercial zone, making that a little broader than just office. Thank you for that clarification. There's also hotels. So there's a number of uses that could either be complementary to office uses or could be the sole use. So we're trying to retain the intent of the development agreement while recognizing that office has some challenges associated with it. So, and I guess my point, sorry, I didn't get to that, is that I don't think we have to necessarily hear from the school district, is this an acceptable piece of property or not? It could be a private school. I mean, there are a number, it's trying to identify potential uses that seem appropriate, and that's the conversation we're having. Should that include residential or not? Staff have recommended no. And so we are looking to sort of conclude this conversation in terms of providing you with a draft for the public hearing.
Right. I just want to make sure that, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I mean, it seems to me that, and I can't do your job for you, but it seems to me that staff sort of couldn't provide any other recommendation than keeping the existing use because of the commitment to, growing in central Issaquah. I mean, that would be sort of counterintuitive, I think, to allow residential in this area. I mean, I have my own opinions about it. I'm just saying, like, if I were you, that's what I would do,
So, but it's also, I think that's the primary one, but because the vision of the city is right now to grow central Issaquah. But, I think coupled with that, we challenge the property owner to get a commitment from the neighborhood to do something else. And we were open to them being able to succeed on that front. And so far, they've not been able to, and that's not a criticism. I think there's been a number of reasons why maybe that hasn't happened. But with both, I think without having the neighborhood say, yes, we would support something different, our challenge was how do we allow the property owner to have some reasonable opportunities, and so that's why the list is bigger than office. It's basically employment-based. I mean, so we really went with, that's why a hotel, is an option, because it's really a business. And so what we said was, what other things could happen there that would actually serve as a business, would reflect that vision of people going there as an employment destination while others were leaving that neighborhood to go to their employment destinations. And so kind of that's where we've kind of stalled at this point.
I don't see it as a viable office space in terms of an office space where a private company would come in and actually occupy and workers would go too. It seems too far off the beaten path, but I don't know that we were actually exploring all the best options. I look at a school, whether it's private or public or an express school to cater to the needs of the community. You look at a school, it's occupied 5 days out of the week. It could be used as a daycare, and on the weekends, it could be used as a church facility. It seems like really a maximum use of the property for the community, and the developer would still be able to develop and make the profit.
So I guess, and maybe this isn't going to sound overly nice, so Ken, I apologize. I'm not sure this is our problem to fix, right? So let's assume that CBRE and TriMet are out there and they're marketing that property for some use that we didn't include in the office commercial zone. What they're going to do is they're going to come and say, hey, we've got an amusement park that we want to put there. We've got something that we want to put there that's not listed in the allowed uses. They have an avenue to basically get that to happen. It's right now, the way we've proposed it is that's a decision by the city council. So they could come and say, we want to do an amusement park. We got a Six Flags ready to go. The city council could decide whether that does or doesn't fit, the needs of our community, and then that could happen. So there's a pathway to get there. I guess I'm saying I don't know that we need to think of all the appropriate land uses and populate the potential land use chart today, because no matter what, there's probably something out there that we haven't thought of.
I totally agree with that. You said it actually nicer than I was going to, because in a sense, the developer has chosen not to go the if we build it, they will come route. They have conditions they want to meet. They want a lease in place. So right now, the lot sits empty. That's how they've chosen to go about it. I don't know that we need to solve the problem of, but who could you really fit in there? And to Troy's point, when looking at both this and with shelter, I like to think about the original intent of how these communities were built when looking at these requests for rezones. So there was a specific purpose of why an amount of land was allocated to commercial and some was residential. The fact that this wasn't residential originally was for a reason. And so I like to try to think about that original intent. And so especially when approaching this from a rezone, is you really want to see where is that benefit to the community, and you want to see where are they coming from. And so while it may feel like 77 townhomes may be harmless in terms of the impact, it may not necessarily fit with how the community originally was being planned, because both in the Highlands and in Talus, these are very intentionally built communities. And when you take away, because I guess I'm trying to lead into shelter holdings, which we're going to go look into next, is that there's a reason that there was these entitlements and why it's been allocated this way. And so I just want to be thoughtful in our way that we approach that.
Now, if we left the zoning as is, then you could put schools and churches, and those kinds of facilities on that property.
Yes.
And not to get into the school conversation too deeply, but in your opinion, Keith, is it actually big enough to put a school or a preschool on it?
Yes, absolutely.
Does that conclude your conversation?
That concludes my comment. Do we have any other comments, discussions?
Okay.
So I say, let's go ahead and close the Talus Parcel 17B discussion, and we'll move on to Section C of the agenda, Issaquah Highlands. And this guest will be Shelter Properties.
Yeah, that's sketchy. Is it a PowerPoint? Yeah. And then you just go up and down, and if you want to point, just use the mouse to move it, because then it records where it is for the home viewer.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Tia Heim with Shelter Holdings. Thanks for having us out again tonight to talk to you a little bit about what we are asking and our thoughts on the proposed zoning. So just to clarify, our request is still the same. Our primary request would be to give us some sort of zoning that would allow for residential use in a vertical mixed-use setting, and that the overlay then would allow some conversion of commercial to residential, again, in only a vertical mixed-use setting, so with retail or services below. You received the memo from us about the senior housing or assisted living. That was something that we heard some possible support from you guys last time we were here, and we definitely heard great support from the community in our extended outreach that we've done over the last year for the possibility of some senior housing or assisted living on our property in the Highlands. The memo outlines 3 potential ways that that could be accomplished. The first being to just zone our property outright, allowing residential, and use the overlay as it's intended to limit what actual uses can go there. So in that way, it would match our entitlement, which has the 3 residential units in addition to the commercial and retail. And you could also allow a portion of the commercial to be converted into senior housing or assisted living. So that would be the second option. The third option would be to specify a certain portion of our property that you thought was appropriate for senior housing or assisted living. So what we had proposed was Block E, which you can see on the map there. The reason why we chose Block E, there were several. Part of it was based on actual interest of senior housing providers. So we have senior housing providers that are very interested in being in Issaquah Highlands and have contacted us. Block E has been one area where they've expressed interest. They like the proximity to the hospital, which makes sense if it's an assisted living facility.
Hey, Tia, could you orient them, because north isn't
This
up.
map is a hard one to see. So you've got Safeway here, Starbucks over here. You've got the hospital over on this side, or I guess back.
And
back
north
here.
is to the right.
And north is this way.
I'm
We
sorry.
just keep changing north on you guys to see if you're paying attention to these maps.
Sorry for the interruption. I just
No,
wanted
I
to make sure they
appreciate
were
it.
tracking.
Which one's E?
E is this one up here. So
Westernmost one.
Okay.
yeah, the other thought that went into it was that having a senior housing or assisted living facility it could be a good transitional use between existing residential community up here and commercial and retail uses on the rest of the property. So that was kind of what went into our thinking about where that could make sense. The reasons why we think it makes sense are, again, there's a market, there's a need, and we think it fits well with existing uses, both the residential that's up there and the commercial and retail that's there and is yet to come. A few responses to staff comments on this particular topic. We really aren't confused about how uses are allowed and how they're categorized. We're simply asking you to take a step back and say, does this use make sense on this property? If the answer is yes, then you look at, well, how do you accomplish it? So if the answer is no, then that's a different discussion. But I think regardless of how you categorize the use or what you call the zone, senior housing makes sense here. We also wanted to point out that it functions and it is treated much like a commercial use throughout the city. So it's allowed in most every zone in the city. The exceptions to that are the residential zones that are really more larger lot type of thing. It also practically functions like more like a commercial use. You have people coming to work. It's not a high traffic generator. Let's see, and we already. Staff had in their response thought that Block A actually made more sense, which Block A is down here. And I think they were thinking that the proximity to the transit center made some sense. That could be, it's not what we've heard from the end user, but we're open. If that's what you think, if you want to designate an area and that area makes more sense to you, we're open to that as well.
Yeah,
Yes.
it is tiered, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Couple questions about the senior housing. What type of senior housing is it? Is it a full assisted living? Is it owner occupied, or is it actually rented? Or are you talking about convalescent because of its location to the hospital?
It could be any of the above. So if one of those categories is more acceptable than others, that's a point of discussion. I mean, we know based on conversations with the community that there is need for everything from a full-on assisted living that needs constant round-the-clock care to options for people who live in the community that are over 55 and want to downsize and live in a more condo or apartment type setting. So the whole spectrum of need is there. It depends on where you want to go with it.
Okay, and how many occupants would be able to occupy that area? That in your proposal or your vision, if it was to be assisted living, and then how would that reflect affordable housing for assisted living?
So I think what we had proposed in the memo, and I don't have it in front of me, so there was a conversion, which I think was like 180,000 square feet.
1,200 square feet of commercial for one residential unit.
Yeah. and
150 units.
150 units is a project size that makes sense and would be sort of typical for the assisted living type facility.
Just for visual reference, so if that was, say, Block E, that would be what, a 4 or 5 story building on the full block, or?
It really depends on who the ultimate developer is. Different developers or operators of assisted living facilities have different models that they like. Some of them like it in more of a stacked building. Some of it like it a little bit more spread out with spaces between. So it depends.
Okay.
But it could definitely fit on that block or on a portion of that block. Any other questions on that before I move on?
Yeah, I'd love to hear a response regarding basically why you think that the entitlement of 3 should become 150. You've given a good example of a need in the community, backed up why it's something you want to do. Help me equivocate those numbers of saying, whoa, we are have a predominant amount of commercial entitlement. We have these 3 dwelling units that gives you that footing for the residential. Help me understand where you're getting to 150 as being a reasonable trade-off.
I don't think we were proposing a conversion of 3 to 150. We were proposing a conversion of commercial to residential only for purposes of senior housing or assisted living.
So it's your position that because of the 3 entitlements that you currently have, that should
totally
blanketly-
separate from that. totally separate from that. That
So
this is a different discussion.
You still want your additional 3 housing units in addition to this. The overlay of the senior housing isn't actually applicable to the residential entitlement.
That was not what we had anticipated.
Okay.
I mean, if that's something you wanted us to consider and
No, I wanna
respond
know
to.
what- I wanna know
But
what you
yeah,
guys are
No,
proposing.
we were not proposing to involve the 3 residential units at all, that this is just something separate that should be considered as you look at zoning the property in full.
Thank you.
Are you even thinking about the 3 residential units? Because it seems like that would be almost a loss. Even bother putting just 3 units up, considering everything else is commercial.
Yes, we want to retain the 3 units. How it would actually be built out, I don't know. We're not at that level of detail. The other thing that we would ask that you consider is that in addition to whatever recommendation you make for zoning, that you also make a recommendation to council that they consider a development agreement with us for our property. It could be an extension of the existing development agreement, but only with respect to our 21 acres. It could be a new development agreement, but we think that this is what makes sense for a parcel of this size in an urban village area. I know there was some concern last time in the discussion about, well, how do you have a development agreement with only one party because Port Blakely's not there? Obviously, we would be the other party, so there would be the city and us. I know there's also concern about certain standards like stormwater or environmentally critical areas not being updated. We'd be willing to make those updates. Obviously, critical areas don't really apply on our site. We're fine with updating to current stormwater standards. We just legitimately believe that planning cohesively for a development over time makes the most sense for the community and for us. And we just need the city to be an active and engaged partner with us to pursue that. So I think, in addition, you need to make a zoning recommendation, but we'd ask that you consider that as well.
What would be captured in the development agreement that wouldn't be captured in the overall updated zoning of the urban village?
Well, a development agreement would essentially replace whatever zoning for that property. So then
I know, but what specifically would that development agreement contain
Well, it
for the
allows you-
city or for you guys that's not going to be captured with no development agreement in the overall urban village zoning?
I guess I would back up to looking at what is zoning versus a development agreement, and zoning just puts rules out there that any parcel that comes in has to comply with, right? With a development agreement, you're taking a big picture look at planning on how does this develop over time. So zoning regulations may or may not change over time. A development agreement keeps a cohesive vision, allows the city and the developer to work together to do things that are outside the normal box and make trades that this is important to, the city is really wants, say a large central plaza in exchange for whatever.
So that's my question. What specifically would be in this development agreement?
I mean, I think generally what we would like to do is have some residential here. I think you heard from Mr. Scanlon at CBRE today what it takes to entice an office user today is quite different from what it was 20 years ago, and they need that 24-hour presence that sort of that mixed-use community brings. So I think there are reasons why not to say develop all of this as mixed-use residential, and I know that we scared some people with bringing the market data, which showed how much residential really could be supported by market up here at our initial meetings, and you hear those big numbers being thrown around. That's not what we're asking for, and that's not what we would be expecting in a development agreement. We'd be trying to work with the city to figure out how do we bring the things that are really desired by the community, including the office user, to Issaquah Highlands. And I think there are some ways that the zoning would be lacking in doing that.
Would you guys be open to having low-income requirements, minimums, in a potential development agreement? You don't have to comment on that. Just
On
curious.
affordable housing,
yeah,
workforce
yeah,
housing?
that's
Yeah, I
right,
mean, we
but
think
affordable housing.
that those are important elements of the community, and we're totally open to addressing those. The other thing I wanted to point out was that until now, development agreements were really the preferred tool for the city on addressing parcels of this size. I mean, the code specifically talks about if you're in an urban village, you're over 15 acres, you should have a development agreement. So this is a total change in approach from the city to thinking, wow, development agreements really aren't maybe don't get us what we want, and zoning definitely gets us what we want. And I'm not sure what's driving that, so I guess I'd put that back to you guys to really think about. Is that a conscious choice that the city wants to make to move away from a development agreement for a large parcel in an urban village setting and just to straight zoning? The last point on that would be just that we're a collaborative and creative developer. Gary has tons of experience doing all kinds of projects, affordable housing, working with King County Metro on park and ride projects. The South Kirkland Park and Ride brought it all together, did Imagine Housing, market rate housing, and park and ride facility all in one, working in multiple jurisdictions. So we'd just be looking for a partner on the other side with us on the city's behalf. The zoning designations. So we were really pleased to see that the staff had moved to combining commercial and retail. We were in no way asking to make all of our entitlement, be able to be switched between commercial and retail. We understand the differences, and that makes sense. I think it makes sense to us to go one step further and use that same logic to say that the sort of everything in the town center area should have the same zoning. Right now, they've got a label of mixed-use residential that would work for everything, and then the overlay, again, dictates the use. So not saying that any of the uses should change necessarily, but that having one zoning designation makes sense. You've only got a few parcels in there that have that UVMUR now, and UVMUR doesn't have to be the name of it. It could be something else. It could just be mixed use, and then it has all the uses under it, and your overlay tells you what you're supposed to do. That makes some sense to us. There are also still some places in the code that need to be cleaned up to reflect the commercial retail combination, and we'll circle back with staff on those. One of them being the building height portion, where it calls out height by zone, and it still calls out commercial zone separate from retail zone.
Clarify question then, Lucy. Did we merge commercial and retail, or we just chose to paint them the same color?
We painted them the same color, and I'll leave it there.
So it's not merging. The uses are still called out separately, but the zoning designation is one, commercial/retail.
Okay.
Then we wanted to respond to a few other issues and questions that were raised in the last meeting. First, on termination of the development agreement, we were never recommending that you do nothing. We were only trying to make clear that there is a process in the development agreement. It actually requires that there's 6 months between the termination of the build-out period and enactment of the new zoning, which the city is, I think, intending to speed up, and I'm not sure why. So I guess our comment would be, don't artificially rush to December just because that's on the schedule. It's not December is not dictated. Getting zoning in place is dictated by the development agreement, but December is not. And then, the next topic, affordable housing or workforce housing. To your question, yes, we're interested in exploring those as options. If this is something that you'd like to see discussed or considered in Issaquah Highlands, now is the time, and we're a willing participant in those discussions. I know somebody pointed out last time that you all have seen lots of discussion about the need for affordable housing, I think at probably all levels in Issaquah, and also a desire for mixed use with residential over commercial and retail. That's what we would like to have be an element of this portion of the Highlands. Also, don't lose sight of the fact that this is, especially on the end closest to the park and ride, this is a transit-oriented development location. It's an opportunity there. Those opportunities aren't everywhere, and you can't make them be in places where there's not transit centers. So you shouldn't take lightly that consideration in figuring out what makes sense for this property. The other thing was the school district. So the school district, we have a great relationship with them. We talk to them often. We have talked to them several times about our property. Our property doesn't really work for them for a variety of reasons, which they could articulate better for you. I would generally tell you that what they've told us is the dimensions of our property don't work well. So, we have grid streets that need to go through and create those blocks. It creates parcels that just really aren't the size or really location that they are interested in. So wanted to get that out on the table for you, because I know that's an issue everybody is interested in. Moving on to a few other points on the code that's in front of you now. First, height. We really appreciate that it's been revised, and we think the revision is really good. We, I guess, would put the question back out there, why the 15-foot minimum floor height on non-residential? Likely things would comply with that, but it was a new requirement that came in this time, wondering where the 15-foot came from. I think in our experience in Seattle, 13-foot would be what they require for the minimum. So just wondering where 15 and why. And then the height issue that I mentioned briefly before in retail versus commercial, the zones are still called out separately, retail having a 40-foot limit and commercial having an 85-foot limit. We think it should really just be an 85-foot limit for that zone. I mean, obviously, you're probably not going to build an 85-foot retail building, but just to clean up, again, the consolidation. Plazas, again, we appreciate the proposed requirement has been decreased, but it's still a really significant requirement. And we struggle with this a little bit because we build buildings that make sense. We build developments that make sense, and we want to have the amenities that make sense for the community and make sense for the end user. And the market dictates that you have the amenities that make sense for the user. So there definitely will be plazas involved. Dictating that they are of a certain size is not ideal for us. In some ways, I think it makes sense. It makes more sense to link the plaza size to the footprint of the building rather than the total floor area of the building. And you kind of see that when you look at the examples that Lucy pulled up, where, in Swedish, where it's a lot denser, their overall percentage is lower, and the Grand Ridge had a little bit higher percentage. I also would encourage you to think about including in the plaza requirement along the same lines as what you talked about with the parks, that it could be plaza or what's the right term, the informal gathering space areas, because there are, again, ways to be creative about making spaces that make sense and are usable today. So if plaza is only a hardscape and you want to put in something that doesn't meet that, informal gathering spaces, I think with the definition, gives some flexibility to work with staff to figure out what makes sense for any given use. Because there are a range of uses here that could potentially go there, and what would make sense as far as plaza or common space is going to be different from one to another. Then there are some things that we just have some confusion on. The biggest one, I think, is, and the most significant one, is when and how the SIDS apply. I'm not sure how that gets referenced in the code itself. So we have a ton of materials, and there are some charts and things that have been provided, and then another one that was provided tonight that was slightly different, that talk about what sections of the SIDS might apply to Issaquah Highlands. But I'm not sure how the end user knows that, and so we actually engaged an architect and said, here's the new code, like tell us what you can build, what could we do here? And they were confused. To me, that's a problem. So, one of the suggestions would be to have a very specific list of, for if you're saying that the landscaping requirements see SID section blah blah blah. It's kind of the chart that's already been provided, but really call it out so it's clear. And I think that's been sort of a general focus for us on, is there certainty for the architects, for the end users? I mean, we're working hard to pull users into Issaquah Highlands, and they need to know that they can be here and that their product will work here. And when it's really confusing, it's really hard to get them to commit. Let's see, what was the other one? So another example of where I don't know where in the SIDS it's coming from, but tonight Lucy pointed out the requirement of when a site development permit is triggered, and that it would change now because we'd fall under the SIDS, and it would be related to building size, which is all fine. I've been working in this code and trying to figure it out, and that was new to me. So that's just one example. Let's see what else. The other question is, I think that the language that was proposed tonight about, how to read it as far as when it says Central Issaquah, you should read it as Issaquah Highlands or Talus as appropriate. That makes some sense. I would ask, though, has anybody reviewed all the SID sections to make sure that there are no inconsistent references? So no references back to, a circulation plan that is actually Central Issaquah's circulation plan, because those are very, very specific. And it just goes to clarity and trying to make things clear for an end user. Inconsistency of terminology was something we brought up before, that the chart that was in, I think, attachment M5 helped to some degree, but it still left some things unclear. There are some columns, sort of if you're following a use across, to try to see how it would be categorized in each zoning, because it's different in each. There are some columns in the SID, or there's some uses in the SIDS columns that are blank, but it's not actually because it's not allowed there, it's because it's called something else or it falls under another category. The way it was presented, I thought, was a little bit confusing, but the explanation was sort of telling in response to our question about that, and the staff's response was that it was too burdensome and potentially misleading to convert the terminology in SIDS and IMC to the proposed, which is exactly my point, that if it's too burdensome for staff to do it for every use, then how is an end user who has not been part of these conversations and is not going to go back and watch all the discussion and pull up all the materials that went into a zoning code, how are they supposed to know? How are we supposed to know when this is all done? Then we get into, the narrowing of uses. I think the biggest concern here is the approach to retail. Retail is something that has been changing probably drastically in the last 10 years, but for sure over the last 20 years from the time the development agreement was written to now. The development agreement took an approach where it really called out specific retail uses in a very particular way. When you look at like Central Issaquah Code, it calls out retail uses, some of them specifically if they have a condition or something unusual about it, but then there are sort of broad categories of retail related to size, so that you kind of catch all the retail as it morphs and changes and you don't try to define everything with specificity up front. We think that the broad catch-alls are required because there's no way that we can know what retail is going to look like in 5 years. I think it'll continue to change in probably significant ways. Specific uses that we have questions about, neighborhood serving retail, I don't know exactly what that means. There's not really a definition. It seems like it's trying to limit the types of retail that we can do there, and I don't know if that's intentional, and without a definition, it's really hard to say. There are things that just don't make sense. Auto supply is one that's being removed. Why? I mean, that seems like a neighborhood serving retail to me. Not necessarily that that's what we want to build there, but why single that one out? Car wash and fuel center are ones that are allowed now. There's obviously already a gas station up there, but it seems like those types of things should continue to be allowed. The fitness versus indoor recreation, the response left me a little bit confused if those were actually different uses or if they're the same use. I think they're the same use, but I guess we'd like some clarity on, are we allowed to do a fitness center under either zone? Commercial support is another one without definition, not entirely sure. It gives some examples of what that would mean, but I don't know if they can be standalone uses or not. Building hardware and garden materials is a good example of how the table was a little bit misleading. It made it look like, yeah, those are all still permitted, but in response to a question, it was like, well, no, actually building materials is now being removed. Again, not necessarily the uses that we're proposing, but we're trying to understand what's changing, and it's difficult. Another important one is leisure and entertainment was a sort of broad category. We think it should stay in there. There's a lot of desire from people up there to have entertainment type uses. Those, again, are changing rapidly. The staff's response was cultural center and indoor recreation should catch everything. I don't think it necessarily does. It might be close. We'd rather, again, for certainty in drawing uses, have categories that are clear. The two sort of unusual examples that we could come up with that we weren't sure really fit in either were sort of the virtual reality, I don't even know what you call it, cafes that are starting to pop up in some places, or the escape room or puzzle solving things. I mean, I'm not sure that they are either of those, but I think that they would be appropriate for there. And then lastly, parking, the structured parking requirement. You guys have talked about it a lot. We probably don't need to talk about it too much more. It was my understanding, based on hearing some of your discussion in your recommendation to council, was that they consider the retail structured parking, and it seemed to be that your opinion was that they would get maybe expert opinions to people to weigh in on what that would look like, and does that make sense to market. I don't know that ever really happened. So our ask would be that you follow the spirit of the development agreement and not require structured parking for retail in Issaquah Highlands. I would point to U Village as a good example of a place where structured parking, as it gets supported by the market, will be built. Not saying we're trying to build University Village up there, so don't be concerned about that. But that's the kind of thing where structured parking will be built when the market dictates it. It's really an expensive element of any project. With that, I will turn it over to Gary to give you a quick summary. Thank you.
Go ahead. There it is. Gary Young, Gary Young, co-founder of Shelter, and I just wanted to say, kind of as an overview, we really appreciate all the work that Lucy and Keith and staff have put into the effort from the meeting prior coming to here. And I think part of this discussion where we're talking about the development agreement and zoning, when Tia gets to these points that she's making, and we're talking about these concerns about all the different uses when you're in the development agreement process, there's kind of all this additional latitude, so you're in this continual discussion, and we've really enjoyed our working relationship with the city all these years and the projects that we've built to date in Issaquah Highlands and working with Lucy and staff. And so now when you suddenly come to more zoning black and white, and then if you miss something and then there's interpretation, then we get nervous. And so I think that we're just trying to cover a lot of information very quickly, and we want to know that everything that is said is with full and entire respect for all of the experience and all the work that's gone on to make this an incredible community, of which we're trying to be a part of for the conclusion of the community and looking at a long-term conclusion. We're going to be working in this particular property for many years because it's large and there's many, many opportunities. So we're trying to kind of grapple with all that, do the best we possibly can to give good feedback, and we're very respectful of each of you here and your dedication to serving, and very good, thoughtful questions that we've observed in each meeting that we attend and that we watch. And I just wanted to summarize saying that these points just quickly touch on what we've just been talking about, and we're very committed to the community, having piloted the very first life enrichment options home here over 20 years ago, built that, and every home since, and very involved with Eastside Baby Corner, the school district, particularly the foundation. We're doing a pilot program right now with the buildings that we built in Issaquah Highlands to provide for housing for teachers, working with the school foundation for the teachers they've just gone through in this recent hiring program, because we have a very critical issue here in Issaquah and in every city. School districts specifically can't attract the the college graduate teachers that may live in Illinois, Detroit, Michigan, whatever, that would like to come out west, but they look at the cost of housing and they just go, there's no way, and they don't want to commute from Auburn. So we're trying to do everything we can to be thoughtful in that respect. That's a separate conversation, but that's why maybe one of those items is up there on the board. So we are here committed to work in a thoughtful way and to get your feedback and to have you consider our thoughts, to provide for opportunities so we can be not looking at just today, but being really thoughtful for what we can do in the future. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Tia. All right, so we're going to go ahead and open this up to public comments. And
The clipboard's over there.
actually, we only have, yes.
It's okay, it can go. I'm not sure if anyone added any names.
No, yeah.
Is there anybody that wants to speak?
Is there anybody who wants to speak?
Steve.
Go ahead.
Thanks. Hi, so I guess a couple thoughts. One, the idea behind mini development agreements has come up before the council before, and whether or not that they should be allowed, or if development agreements provided such a large scope that there'd be some larger public scope to be allowed. I guess I'm kind of saying I'm not really in favor of mini development agreements. I can see the Highlands agreement being extended to incorporate our idea. I don't like a mini development agreement just for a particular development site. That does not make sense to me. There's not enough public good, I think, in looking at that. I do kind of like the idea of a transitory development, some way to include that next to the area. I don't know if there's enough public good to allow more density in there that would allow that to happen. Maybe that's a worthwhile discussion. The topic of schools came up. If we allow this additional housing, how would the schools incorporate those additional school students that would expect to be live there. We're already looking at building a second school up in the Highlands. How would that incorporate? That needs to be part of the discussion. I don't also understand, it was initially zoned to be commercial with the idea there'd be some public good. I guess the idea is people were living in Issaquah, then people who worked there would come up there and then counterbalance. I think we're losing that idea of if we just change it to residential or sales and not commercial use. So I think there needs to be just further discussion on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Any other public comment? No? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and close public comment, and we'll open it up to commission discussion.
I just need to be educated on the difference. I thought assisted living was commercial. I'm a little confused on that. I didn't think it was residential. I thought assisted living was commercial.
So it's a residential use. It occurs in mixed use, often predominantly commercial zones. So when Shelter raised this question, I went back and looked at assisted living in the Issaquah Highlands Development Agreement, in the Talus Development Agreement, in Central Issaquah, and in the IMC, the General Municipal Code. And in all circumstances, it's listed as a residential use. It is listed as a residential use that is appropriate in commercial, mixed use, and residential zones. And where that really comes into play is where we're dealing with this entitlement. You know, what basket does it fall into? Because typically in Central Issaquah, it's allowed in commercial zones, and it doesn't matter whether it's considered residential or commercial, because it's just what uses are allowed.
I think, in my opinion, I think assisted living, fits the spirit of what the community intended for this space. I don't think senior housing does. I think that's residences who just happen to be old. But I think assisted living. I mean, it's a bit on the continuum. But if you build a hospital that has 200 beds, there isn't a discussion about are there entitlement for 200 residents. I mean, assisted living is more on the continuum towards residency, but I think I'm open to converting commercial space to assisted living, because I think that fits the spirit of what that space used for. I've been to assisted living facilities frequently. They feel like a workspace. They're usually open 24/7 with people coming to work. I mean, there are people that are staying there, but they're staying there usually for more short to medium term. So I think I'm open to that kind of interpretation, and then applying some of their entitlement towards that use of space.
So let's unpack that a little bit. So if you're saying that assisted living is a business and therefore should be allowed within commercial use, does that go true for Talus as well?
I think we need to define what assisted living is.
I would say yes. I think if Talus wanted to use their commercial space to build a true assisted living, not senior housing, assisted living.
Not independent living. There's a difference between the two.
Definitely, yeah. But assisted living where you've got 24/7 staff and all that, I think I'm open to that being an allowed commercial use. And I don't even think if that was how we went, I don't even think you need to do the conversion to residential. That would just be a consumption of their commercial square footage.
That's what I heard.
I'm kind of with AJ on this. I kind of like the idea of assisted living. Assisted living doesn't really add an impact to schools. It doesn't really add an impact to.
They don't really drive either, by the way.
Yeah, they don't
drive a lot.
They don't really use the parks. I mean, they're more there, similar to not.
Yeah, they do.
No, in all seriousness, not to belittle them, but they're not consuming public spaces any more so than someone who's at an inpatient hospital facility. I think the impact is much more people coming there to work, or people coming there to visit people that live there. So I think I'm open to that. I think we can have a discussion about whether that's something that we would want to allow everywhere that's commercial, or whether that would be an exception that we'd allow as part of a development agreement. I think that might be an interesting discussion, but I do think that fits, unlike I think what Talus was proposing, converting commercial space to townhomes, that did not fit the spirit of what was originally intended in Talus. I think this does fit the spirit of what we wanted this space to be, as relatively dense, a place that people both live at, but also a place that provides employment that is active during the day, et cetera.
Is there a policy around, I agree with you 100% on that, on those comments. Is there a policy around what defines assisted living? And the reason why I bring it up is because I want to make sure assisted living, what, if there are different levels, then we need to have something that says we accept these different levels.
So the continuum is independent living to assisted living to nursing, which is full care, right? So assisted means you need somebody to come in and help you do your daily, maybe bathing, maybe eating. So there's staff. And then, nursing is, you're probably bedridden for the most part. I mean, so assisted living is definitely, you cannot live by yourself.
Okay. And the other topic of convalescent, because it's also its proximity to Swedish, would be really an ideal location for both types of facilities, and it would allow people to sort of age in place, I guess, right? They would be able to go transition from assisted to convalescent in the need be, and they already have their doctors maybe set up with Swedish and.
So not necessarily age in place. That's Timber Ridge's model, where you have all three of those facilities in one location, where you start in independent living, then you go to potentially assisted, and then ultimately to nursing care. What it would allow you to do potentially is age in your neighborhood. So if you lived in the Highlands in, say, either ownership or rental housing, and then you got to a point where you needed care, you could potentially stay in your neighborhood if there's a facility located in that neighborhood. That's the value. So it's staying in your neighborhood, not necessarily in place. Place is a bigger word, I guess.
And with Talus being mostly young families,
so right now, Timber Ridge is, what I understand is Timber Ridge is at capacity for their assisted living facility and their nursing.
Add something to that too. With Timber Ridge, in order to get into the assisted living level or 24-hour care level, you have to first have gone in and passed a health exam and go in as a healthy senior. And they have to certify that you are healthy before you can even buy a unit within Timber Ridge. And then if you become ill or have a health issue, then you can move into assisted. But you can't go directly into Timber Ridge assisted. You have to start out healthy and ambulatory, and then
Independent
progress.
living.
Independent, thank you.
So there was an assisted living facility looking across SO 900 from the entrance to Talus, a facility called Silverado. Unfortunately for them, it wasn't allowed in the existing zoning. It required a rezone to allow an assisted care facility in that particular residential zone. What that tells me is that there's a market for that assisted care facility proximate to Timber Ridge as well. And it just may be that there's a demand in our community for those type of facilities now, because there's not an abundance of them, and there's a big swath of baby boomers needing additional care. So I think there's some rationale for proximity to Swedish. There's probably some rationale for proximity to Timber Ridge as well.
Pity those guys aren't here to that part of the conversation.
Yeah.
I think another comment I'd make, especially since they're offering the idea of development agreement, I'm really keen on using the opportunity to get some affordable units. I don't know how that would work for assisted living versus, but I think using what was previously in the Highlands of 30%, I think it was 10, 10, and 10, the different income brackets. I think using a similar framework here, I think would be great, and that would really help show to the community that there's an additional community benefit that's incorporated, this additional use above and beyond what's the current allowed use. So I think that's a potentially an exciting opportunity to get some affordable assisted living in addition to market rate.
So there's a couple different tools that you can use to do that. One is a development agreement. The other is simply the zoning action.
Okay.
So if the city zoned and allowed residential entitlement on their property, the city could require as part of an inclusionary action.
Definitely, yeah. It doesn't need to be a development agreement. It could be inclusionary zoning too.
Right.
But in your opinion, Keith, to do assisted living, do we need to have residential entitlement?
No, not for us. I don't think. I mean, so given what Lucy said earlier, I don't know what the development agreements where they put assisted living, if they did at all.
Residential.
It was in residential.
I'm providing facts.
This is definitely.
I haven't gotten to opinions yet.
I think this is definitely a philosophical piece for you guys. If you guys believe that assisted living and/or nursing is equivalent to a commercial use, I think you can just recommend it be allowed within commercial.
I think that I agree. That would be the correct. That would be the best mechanism.
So,
but I think our question for you right now.
Right now, no.
Not in the development agreement, but just in a commercial lot someplace else in Issaquah.
Yeah,
that's
we're
zoned
not
commercially.
going there yet right now. I'm not rewriting the zoning.
No, I'm not rewriting. No, my question wasn't a change. My question is right now, if I owned a commercial lot, can I build an assisted living?
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so it isn't an allowed use in commercial outside of the Highlands?
So, do I need to get geeky on you?
Yes.
Okay, I thought you might say that. So, if you look in the IMC, assisted living is always listed under residential when you want to look at the standards, even though it's allowed in a commercial zone.
Okay.
So, my interpretation of that is it's a residential use that's allowed in a commercial zone because it's appropriate, the way Tia described it. Now, does that mean that we cannot do this? It's just a policy change in the city, and you can make that recommendation. I think that the thing that comes along, though, is are you saying anywhere on their property or certain locations, or it's just an added use, and therefore if the whole thing is, if all 1.8 million square, 1.6 million square feet is of commercial is assisted living, are we okay with that? And I'm just asking.
I think philosophically, yeah. I think that would be a bit strange, but it wouldn't be that different than if they just built a Safeway that was 1 million square feet. I mean, I wouldn't.
Safeway is very happy to hear you say.
I wouldn't want that. And that'd be very strange. But the fact that that's allowed isn't problematic to me.
How do the rest of the commission feel about adding assisted living to commercial uses in both Issaquah Highlands and Talus?
I agree with that.
I agree with it, and I actually like the idea of it in the Talus community.
Do we want to I guess we can make a motion for it.
No. We're giving you a new draft for your public hearing. That's when you get to make motions.
We're winding up for the real deal.
I'm asking the question.
This is informal, so.
That's all. Okay.
I don't know that I would equivocate them. I think that it's an enticing idea, but I would like to hear a little more from staff before I jump on this train. I appreciate the enthusiasm, but I don't equivocate them as being all commercial is the same. And again, my point that I made earlier is the intention. And can you remind me, when did Shelter Holdings purchase this?
When did Shelter purchase this property? Like 5 years ago?
It was about 5 years ago. And originally it was from Rowley, is that correct?
No, it came from Microsoft.
Came from the Microsoft, okay, thank you. So I guess what I would want to try to do is, I would, if we were to allow the assisted living, I would want to limit it, because I don't equivocate them all to the commercial space. And when I look at the need of the retail and the commercial that is still yet to really fully be realized within the Highlands, I don't know that I would equivocate them all. So.
No, I think, Joy, I think you make a great point, especially on ensuring that the retail is still built out. I think that's something that we're very, very, very keen on. I think there's maybe other ways to get to that were, for instance, we could continue to require, say, ground level retail. I don't know if that's built into it. I know in Central Issaquah, there's this is getting into vertical mixed use, which I missed that meeting. But you could do something where maybe you'd allow that, but then ensure that there's still, retail on the ground floor. So we're still ensuring that we're expanding the retail footprint of the Highlands to keep those streets active. And if on the upper levels it happens to be assisted living versus office space, then so be it. But you're still ensuring that retail is being built out. I think those are definitely things that we want to consider.
Okay.
Because I think you're right. I do think, a monolith block of just assisted living and then nothing else, I don't think would have the active street that we would want. And the mix of uses, as the shelter has stressed, they do want mixed use. And so I think we want to make sure that it is actually implemented in multiple uses and not just one.
So did you have thoughts between Block A, which was this northern one near the Park and Ride, or Block E down here? This is where they were talking about the, being near residential, and then here's where Swedish is, although they own the property all the way up to Discovery.
I have a strong preference for Block A being by the transit center for allowing that.
I don't have a preference. I don't see a reason for us to specify where at this time. But I think that's certainly something we can discuss at the next meeting.
Others?
I agree.
Which?
I'm just in agreement. No, I don't really have a preference either. I like the fact that if we picked with something like Block E, it's closer to the hospital, but at Block A is closer to the transit center. We don't have to say the transit center because most likely if it's going to be assisted living, that group of people may have more limited access to vehicles. So having that access of walking distance to transit might be better.
It's also generally a low-income workforce too, so the access to transit for the workforce, I think, could be beneficial.
And that's what the point I was going to make. If we're also looking at low-income housing or any subsidized housing, they're more likely to be in the workforce and need access to transit center, perhaps considerably more than an individual who's in assisted living needing access to a bus.
Yeah, though keep in mind, I think that the vision of assisted living, these would not be people that are commuting to work.
Which is why I think A, close to the hospital is a better location than across the street from the transit. So,
are we still considering residential? I thought we were considering commercial mixed use.
So what I've heard so far is add assisted living as a commercial use.
Yes.
And the only residential piece that I heard floated was affordable housing.
Well, yeah, though I actually would love to see the affordable housing be a part of the assisted living. And whether that's through inclusion or zoning or a development agreement, but I don't think you need to add residential. I think it can still be just assisted living, and there's just an affordable requirement associated with the subset of the available beds or rooms or whatever the right metric would be.
Well, as I understand it, they currently have 3 units for 3 residential units. That's it. So you would have to, we would have to, I believe, actually, change.
Yeah. So that I guess that's a good point. That's to my question. Can we have an affordability requirement
on those 3 units?
No. I don't think it would be the 3 units. It would be on the assisted living beds. I think is what I was envisioning. And
so if it depends on how you get there, I think. So if you say that assisted living is equivalent to a business use and therefore should be allowed within the business uses, I don't think you can. If you say assisted living is residential, but we're going to allow it within commercial up to a certain point, you could then consider that an upzone and put a requirement on it.
Yeah, I would rather do the mechanism that would allow us to implement the affordability requirement, just from a legal mechanical way.
All right, so we'll talk that through with city attorney, and we'll come back and.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if it's not possible, it's not possible. But I'd rather have the dominoes fall such that you'd be able to get that extra concession.
So let's before we go off down a rabbit hole.
Right.
Can we see kind of the sentiment of the group in terms of whether that makes more sense, or where we kind of started, which was it's allowed within a certain amount within commercial?
I would be much more willing to consider the amendment of assisted living within commercial if a significant portion of it was mandated to be affordable housing. I'm talking about like 50%. I mean, I would want to see something that actually is a game changer. Telling me that you're going to have a ratio of 1 to 10 on the beds is a little less enticing, especially considering the fact that I don't know how we control the buyer who initially goes in and builds, and then that changes hands to somebody else. You start to get a little bit tricky as far as to how that continues through with different ownership, and that's something we've seen really common in Issaquah. Something starts out as being affordable housing and ends up changing over and just becoming market rate housing. I'd hate to see that happen at the same thing when we have an intent, so I would want to know that legally we were able to keep that intent in place.
I would have a different view on that. My background in my dark past was as a nurse, and I've also worked in nursing homes, and I've worked in assisted living. And the business model of an entity that has a for-profit operation of an assisted living is not a model that fits with this subsidized or otherwise leveraged cost. So what you're really doing is looking at a totally different business model, and you're going to limit how many companies are going to actually come in and offer their services as assisted living. My view as a retired executive from the insurance industry is you will have a taker of none that will move into that business model. I think we're going to be...
No, you'd have facilities that take Medicare.
I'm sorry.
You have facilities that take Medicare rather than being for private, and you have people who are at a different end of the scale. What you do is you actually have the requirement be for people who actually would take lower forms of insurance than necessarily people who aren't able to pay out of pocket.
That is not the same thing, though, that you're talking about. That is a whole different business model.
So maybe we should
I would
actually
question that.
look at more of the policy as opposed to the occupant, right?
So why don't we've heard from at least some of you. If those who haven't said anything yet on this particular topic, please add your 2 cents. Why don't we go back, we'll talk to the city attorney, we'll talk to Shelter, get their perspective, and by the time we come back, we'll kind of put this thing in a box.
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't know enough about if it's even possible to try to mesh affordability or affordable housing with this business model.
And
I mean, maybe if it is, great, and if it's not.
And if it's not, then it's not, and then we'll look at it, adding it through a different mechanism. Because I think, yeah, I was excited about it as a potential community benefit, but if the position of staff is that it's not feasible, then I don't think we need to pursue it. But let's look into it and discuss it next time.
So I will be interested to hear what staff says, but I also, and while I'm very much in favor of having affordable housing, to me it seems like it's incongruous to say that this is a commercial use, and we expect it to be a workforce, and we expect it to be an employer, and then to also say, but as residential, we also want to have this affordable. So to me, it seems a bit incongruous to have both arguments at play. And to me, it does seem like this would be an employer, as long as we can require that it be assisted living and it be 24-hour and that it have staff and that it be an employer. That model, that to me seems like a use of a commercial space, and it goes to that model more.
I guess the next step is we need the city's guidance.
Yeah,
We'll do that.
we got that.
Input. And and then I know that we don't normally open up for public comment again, but I think Gary had a question that he probably wanted a comment.
A quick comment, hopefully, Gary.
Gary,
At
a
10 to
very
10.
quick comment is that in the model, the comments that were made relative to the way the business model works, forward is absolutely correct, and all the groups that we've talked to we would not be able to do the program. Just so you know, I'm sorry, but that's just the way it seems to be.
I had a question. So it seems to me that, we have these two applicants coming to us. The first applicant revised pretty significantly from last week, though it seems that they still don't have the benefit of the community. In a broad sense, I feel that what we're looking at tonight is really not much of a revision. They've added the component of having assisted living in the commercial use, but otherwise this seems to look very similar to what we looked at last week. So if there's something that's glaringly jumping out, then please point that out to me. But I want to just circle to you real quick that I am not a proponent of asking the city right now for an additional development agreement and would like to move forward with zoning being applied to this lot. The applicant put a lot of questions to staff that they have issues with. I don't want you to have to go through them all right now tonight, but some of them I felt I had answers to based on what I was hearing from you. So I'm hoping that some of those answers can be cleared up just from you responding to the applicant, because I don't know that all of them are actually open questions. I thought we had some answers to those. So I'm hoping to have some of that clarity given, because I felt I had a little more clarity than maybe the applicant did. That which leads me to my next question of specifically regarding the 3 residential units. Last week we were talking about basically giving an asterisk in a sense of saying, no, this is not a mixed-use residential space. However, we still want to honor those 3 units that you have. Is there any, is that still the position of staff? Because right now the applicant is still requesting the same thing as last week. To me, this looks like it's the exact same package, and I guess I want to make sure that staff is still saying, yeah, we're still having our still same opinion about that.
Right, so you may have noticed that there was a general table that was following all the land use maps that listed all the non-single family properties and what their overlay was. And then there was an additional table, and I can pull this up if it's helpful, that provided kind of unique things for certain properties. For instance, if it was mixed use, to clarify that, the apartment on the 5th floor couldn't claim now they're retail, to assign addresses to it. In the same way with shelter, we identified that it needed to be 5 dwelling units per acre. That's the minimum density that's currently in the development agreement. Between 5 and 80 dwelling units per acre is the range. And so that would necessitate a maximum parcel size of 1/6 of an acre, which is 3% of their property, which to us indicates that mixed-use residential would be very misleading. So we put the 3 dwelling units as part of that additional detail table. If they chose to convert it to non-residential, we would support that. If they want to retain them as residential units, we're fine with that, but it would be with the understanding that it was 3 dwelling units and it could be on no more than 1/6 of an acre. Does that answer your question?
Yes. I wanted to make sure. I don't think I'd heard from staff as far as kind of the proposal as it was, and I didn't want to make assumptions.
Right. We didn't. I mean, we got the 2 memos that were attached to the briefing response memo. We got those like the day before the package went out. So we were very happy to get that additional detail and provide it to you, but we didn't provide any additional position. And I think that while the proposals are evolving and we appreciate the conversation, it has not substantially changed our position, although that's why we're having a conversation again with the commission.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? No? Okay. We have one last here from audience comments. Do you have any additional audience comments? No? Okay. So audience comments are now closed. We're now on to other business announcements. And Lucy, do we have any announcements or other business?
We'll see you next week.
I'll see you next week.
All right, so
Ron, can I make a proposal?
Yes.
That I'd like to propose that for our meeting next week, the PPC invites the UVDC to sit in on our
Oh.
discussion.
I am really glad you brought that up because I had wrote that down. Yes, so I'd like to invite UVDC to our next PPC meeting, which is going to be
next
September 28th, Thursday at 6:30.
So you actually have, I think, 3 hearings that night?
Do.
5?
Oh, 2.
Yeah.
So I think it's vertical mixed use and end of development agreements? No.
No.
I'm really confused.
Vertical mixed use. I think it's vertical mixed use.
No,
and then-
it is,
and
no,
these two.
it is end of days. We've already done architecture.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Okay, I'm with you.
Okay,
Got it.
so
It would
you
be
have-
great in the way that we merged with, for the design, and when we merged with, we invited the Development Commission to join us for that. In
You
the
guys
same
were up
way,
here, they were down
I
here.
think that would be great to be able to
Okay.
have that,
Yeah.
again, that impact.
Okay, we will do our best to get UVDC's participation. I think that would be great as well.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to adjourn the meeting at 9:58. Good night.
Thank you.